Volume 3, Chapter 8 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Agnes appears likely to profit by the change of aunts. The first waking under the consciousness of new and not yet familiar happiness is perhaps one of the most delightful sensations of which we are susceptible. Agnes had closed her eyes late, and it was late when she opened them, for Peggy had already drawn her window curtains, and the gay hangings and large looking glasses of the apartment met her eyes at the first glance with such brilliant effect, that she fancied for an instant she must still be dreaming. But by degrees all the delightful truth returned upon her mind. Where was the blank, cold isolation of the heart with which her days were used to rise and set? Where were the terrors amidst which she lived, lest her protectress should expose herself by some monstrous new absurdity? Where was the hopeless future before which she had so often wept and trembled? Was it possible that she was the same Agnes Willoughby who had awoke with such an aching heart but 24 hours ago? All these questions were asked and gaily answered, before she had resolution to spring from her bed, and change her delightful speculations for a more delightful reality. Notwithstanding the various fatigues of the preceding day, Miss Compton was not only in the drawing room, but her letter to Lady Elizabeth Norris was already written on the third side of a sheet of letter paper, thus giving Agnes an opportunity of explaining everything before her own lines should meet her ladyship's eye. The meal, which had been slandered as lazy, lounging, and most unsocial, was far otherwise on the present occasion. The aunt and niece sat down together, each regaling the eyes of the other with a countenance speaking the most heartfelt happiness; and while the old lady indulged herself with sketching plans for the future, the young one listened as if her voice were that of fate, declaring that she should never taste of sorrow more. " The carriage will be here at 12, Agnes," said Miss Compton, " to take us into what our books tell us is called the City, as if it were the city of cities, and about which I suppose you and I are equally ignorant, seeing that you never did take that pleasant little walk the Dowager Mrs. Barnaby so considerately sketched out for you. So now we shall look at it together. But don't fancy, my dear, that any such idle project as looking at its wonders is what takes me there now. I have got a broker, Agnes, as well as the widow, and it is quite as necessary to my proceedings as to hers that I should see him. But we must not go till our partnership letter is ready for the post. Here is my share of it, Agnes. Read it to me, and if it meets your approbation, sit down, and let your own precede it." The lines written by Miss Compton were as follows: "Madam, permit a stranger, closely connected by the ties of blood to Agnes Willoughby, to return her grateful thanks for kindness extended to her at a moment when she greatly needed it. That she should so have needed it, will ever be a cause of self-reproach to me, nor will it avail me much either in my own opinion or in that of others, that the same qualities in our common kinswoman Mrs. Barnaby which produced the distress of Agnes, produced in me the aversion which kept me too distant to perceive their effects on her respectability and happiness. I am, madam, your grateful and obedient servant, Elizabeth Compton." Agnes wrote: "My kind and generous friends, Lady Elizabeth, Lady Stephenson, I write to you as I never dared hope to do, from under the eye and the protection of my dear Aunt Compton. It is to her I owe all the education I ever received, and I might add, all the happiness too; for I have never known any happy home but that which her liberal kindness procured for me during 5 years spent in the family of my beloved instructress, Mrs. Wilmot. For the 7 months that have elapsed since I quitted Mrs. Wilmot, my situation, as you, my kind friends, know but too well, has been one of very doubtful respectability, but very certain misery. My Aunt Compton blames herself for this, but you, if I should ever be so happy as to make you know my Aunt Compton, will blame me. Her former kindness ought to have given me courage to address her before, even though circumstances had placed me so entirely in the hands of Mrs. Barnaby as to make the separation between us fearfully wide. But, thank God, all this unhappiness is now over. I did apply to her at last, and the result has been the converting me from a very hopeless, friendless, and miserable girl, as I was when you first saw me, into one of the very happiest persons in the whole world. I have passed through some scenes, from the remembrance of which I shall always shrink with pain, but there have been others. There have been points in my little history which have left an impression 1,000 times deeper, and dearer too, than ever could have been produced on any heart unsoftened by calamity. And must it not ever be accounted among my best sources of happiness that the regard which can never cease to be the most precious, as well as the proudest boast of my life, was expressed under circumstances which to most persons would have appeared so strongly against me? My generous friends, may I hope that the affection shown to me in sorrow will not be withdrawn now that sorrow is past? May I hope that we shall meet again, and that I may have the great happiness of making my dear aunt known to you? She is all kindness, and would take me to Cheltenham that I might thank you in person for the aid so generously offered in my hour of need, but I fear poor Mrs. Barnaby's adventures will for some time be too freshly remembered there for me to wish to revisit it." When Agnes had written thus far, she stopped. "Where shall I tell them, Aunt Betsy, that we are going to remain?" she said. If Colonel Hubert—" and she stopped again. "If Colonel Hubert, and what then, Agnes?" "Why, if Colonel Hubert were to pay us a visit, Aunt Betsy, I cannot help thinking he would understand me better now than when I was so dreadfully overpowered by the feeling of my desolate condition. Don't you think so?" "I think it very probable he might, my dear. And as to your sensible question, Agnes, of where we are going to be, I think you must decide it yourself. We have both declared against Cheltenham, and for reasons good. Where, then, should you best like to go?" "To Clifton, Aunt Betsy. It was there I saw him first, and there, too, I was most kindly treated by friends who, I believe, pitied me because I did not seem happy, I suppose. Oh, I would rather go to Clifton than any place in the world, excepting Empton." "And to Empton we cannot go just at present, Agnes. It would be too much like running out of the world again, which I have no wish at all to do. To Clifton, therefore, we will go, dear child, and so you may tell your good friends." Agnes gave no other answer than walking round the table and imprinting a kiss upon the forehead of her happy aunt. Then resuming her writing, she thus concluded her letter. "My aunt Compton, as soon as she has concluded some business which she has to settle in London, will go to Clifton, where I believe we shall stay for some months; and should any of your family happen again to be there, I may perhaps be happy enough to see them. With gratitude to all, I remain ever your attached and devoted Agnes Willoughby." Poor Agnes! She was terribly dissatisfied with her letter when she had written it. Not all her generalizations could suffice to tell him, the only mortal him she remembered in the world, not all her innocent little devices to make it understood that he was included in all her gratitude and love, as well as in her invitation to Clifton, made it at all clear that she wanted Colonel Hubert to come and offer to her again. Yet what could she say more? She sat with her eye fixed on the paper, and a face full of meaning, though what that meaning was it might not be very easy to decide. "What is my girl thinking of?" said Miss Compton. "I am thinking," replied Agnes, and she shook her head. "I am thinking that Colonel Hubert will never understand from this letter, Aunt Betsy, how very much I want to see him again." "That is very true, my dear." "Is there anything else I could say to make him know how greatly he mistook me when he fancied I said no from my want of love?" "Oh yes, my dear, certainly." "Tell me then, my dear, dear aunt. I feel as if I had no power to find a word. Tell me what I shall say to him." "You may say many things. For instance, you may say, 'Tell my beloved Colonel Hubert.'" "Oh, Aunt Betsy, Aunt Betsy, you are laughing at me," cried Agnes, looking at her very gravely and with an air of melancholy reproach. "So I am, my dear. An old spinster of 80 is but a poor confidant in matters of this sort. But if you seriously ask for my advice, I will give it, such as it is. Let our letter go just as it is, without any addition or alteration whatever. If Colonel Hubert sees this letter, as you seem to expect, and if he loves you as you deserve to be loved, he will find food enough for hope therein to carry him further than from one end of Gloucestershire to the other. If he does not see it, but what you will in it, he would learn nothing thereby. But if seeing it he determines to sit quietly down under your refusal, then let him. I, for one, should feel no wish to become better acquainted with the gentleman." Agnes said no more, but folded the letter and directed it to Lady Elizabeth Norris, Cheltenham. "Now, aunt, I have folded up Colonel Hubert, and put him out of sight till he shall choose to bring himself forward again. I will tease you no more about him. Shall I put my bonnet on? The carriage has been waiting for some time." "My darling Agnes," said the old lady, looking fondly at her, "how little I deserve to find you so exactly what I wished you should be. You are right. We will talk no more of this Colonel Hubert till he has himself declared what part he means to play in the drama before us. We shall be at no loss for subjects. Remember how much we have to settle between us. Our establishment, our equipage, our wardrobes, all to be decided upon, modelled, and provided. Get ready, dearest. The sooner we get through our business, the earlier we shall be at Clifton. And who knows which part of our dramatis personae may arrive there first?" A happy smile dimpled the cheek of Agnes as she ran out of the room to equip herself, and in a few minutes the two ladies were en route towards the city. "What makes you wear such very deep mourning, my dear?" said Miss Compton, fixing her eyes on the perennial black crape bonnet of her companion. "Is it all for the worthy apothecary of Silverton? But that can't be either, for now I think of it, his charming widow had half the colours of the rainbow about her. What does it mean, Agnes?" Agnes looked out of the window to conceal a smile, but recovering her composure, answered, "I have never been out of mourning, aunt, since Mr. Barnaby died. There was a great deal of black not worn out, and as it made no difference to me—" "Oh, monstrous!" interrupted Miss Compton. "I see it all. While she wantons about like a painted butterfly, she has thrown her chrysalis case upon you, my pretty Agnes, in the hope of making you look like a grub beside her. Is it not so?" "Oh, no. My aunt Barnaby loves dress, certainly, and greatly dislikes black, and so—" "And so you are to wear it for her? Well, Agnes, you shan't abuse her if you think it a sin, God forbid, but do not refuse to let me into a few of her ways. Did she ever ask you to put on her widow's cap, my dear? It might have saved the expense of nightcaps, at least." It was almost a cruelty in Agnes to conceal the many characteristic traits of selfish littleness which she had witnessed in her widowed aunt, from the caustic contemplation of her spinster one, for she would have enjoyed it. But it was so much in her nature to do so, that dearly as she would have loved to amuse Aunt Betsy, and give scope to her biting humour on any other theme, she gave her no encouragement on this. So by degrees all allusion to Mrs. Barnaby dropped out of their discourse, and if from time to time some little sample of her peculiarities peeped forth involuntarily in speaking of the past, the well-schooled old lady learned to enjoy them in silence, and certainly did not love her niece the less for the restraint thus put upon her. Considering how complete a novice our spinster practically was as to everything concerning the vast Babylon called London, she contrived to go where she wished and where she willed with wonderfully few blunders. It was all managed between William and herself, and Agnes marvelled at the ease with which much seemingly important business was transacted. The carriage was stopped before a very dusky-looking mansion at no great distance from the Exchange, within the dark passage of which William disappeared for some moments, and then returning, opened the carriage door, and without uttering a word, gave his arm to assist Miss Compton to descend. "I will not keep you waiting long, my dear," she said, and without further explanation, followed her confidential attendant into the house. In about half an hour she returned, accompanied by a bald-headed, yellow-faced personage, who, somewhat to the surprise of Agnes, mounted the carriage after her, and placed himself as bodkin between them. "To the bank," was the word of command then given, and in a moment they again stopped, and Agnes was once more left alone. The interval during which she was thus left was this time considerably longer than the last, and she had long been tired of watching the goers and comers, all bearing, however varied their physiognomy, the same general stamp of busy, anxious interest upon their brows, before the active old lady and her bald-headed acquaintance reappeared. The old gentleman handed her into the carriage, and then took his leave amidst a multitude of obsequious bows, and assurances that her commands should always be obeyed at the shortest notice, etc., etc., etc. "Agnes," said the old lady, as soon as she had exchanged a few words with William as to where she next wished to go, "Agnes, I look to you to supply the place of my bees and my flowers, and I do not much fear that I shall lament the exchange; but you must not continue to be dight in this grim fashion. It might be soothing to the feelings of Mr. Barnaby's fond widow, but to me it is very sad and disagreeable. And so, my dear, here is wherewithal to change it." During the whole of this speech Miss Compton had been employed in extracting a pocket book of very masculine dimensions from her pocket; and having at length succeeded, she opened it, drew forth 2 banknotes of £25 each, and laid them in the lap of her niece. Agnes took them up, and looked at them with unfeigned astonishment. "My dear aunt," she said, "I am afraid you will find me a much younger and more ignorant sort of girl than you expected. I shall no more know what to do with all this money than a child of 5 years old. You forget, Aunt Betsy, that I have never had any money of my own since I was born, and I really do not understand anything about it. This is a trouble of a new and peculiar kind, my dear, and I really don't remember, in all my reading, to have found a precedent for it. What shall we do, Agnes? Must you always wear this rusty-looking black gown, because you don't know how to buy another?" "Why, no, aunt. I don't think that will be necessary either. But don't you think it would be better for you to buy what you like for me? It won't be the first time, Aunt Betsy. I have not forgotten when my pretty trunk was opened by Mrs. Wilmot, or how very nicely everything was provided for the poor ragged little girl who never before, as long as she could remember, had possessed anything beside threadbare relics cobbled up to suit her dimensions. It was you who thought of everything for me then, and I'm quite sure you love me a great deal better now," and Agnes placed the notes in Miss Compton's hands as she spoke. "I had prepared myself for a variety of new occupations," replied the spinster, "but choosing the wardrobe of an elegant young lady was certainly not one of them. However, my dear, I have no objection to show you that my studies have prepared me for this too. Nothing like novel reading, depend upon it, for teaching a solitary recluse the ways of the world. You shall see how ably I will expend this money, Agnes. But do not turn your head away, and be thinking of something else all the time, because it is absolutely necessary, I do assure you, that a young lady in possession of 1,500 a year should know how to buy herself a new bonnet and gown." The value of Miss Compton's literary researches was by no means lowered in the estimation of Agnes by the results of the 3 hours which followed; for though there were moments in which her thoughts would spring away, in spite of all she could do to prevent it, from discussions on silks and satins to a meditation on her next interview with Colonel Hubert, she was nevertheless sufficiently present to what was passing before her eyes to be aware that an old lady, who has herself lived in a grogram gown for half a century, may be capable of making a mighty pretty collection of finery for her niece, provided that she has paid proper attention to fashionable novels, and knows how to ask counsel as to what artiste to drive to, from so intelligent an aide-de-camp as William. In short, by the united power of the money and the erudition she had hoarded, Miss Compton contrived, in the course of a fortnight, to make as complete a change in the equipments of Agnes as that performed of yore upon Cinderella by her godmother. Nor was her own wardrobe neglected. She had no intention that the rusticity of her spinster aunt should draw as many eyes on Agnes as the gaudiness of her widowed one, and proved herself as judicious in the selection of sable satins and velvets for herself, as in the choice of all that was most becoming and elegant for the decoration of her lovely niece. Never, certainly, was an old lady more completely happy than the eccentric, proud, warm-hearted Aunt Betsy, as, with a well-filled purse, she drove about London, and found everything she deemed suitable to the proper setting forth of her heiress ready to her hand or her order. She could not indeed have a carriage built for her; she could not afford time for it; but William, the indefatigable William, ransacked Long Acre from one end to the other, till he had discovered an equipage as perfect in all its points as any order could have made it. And on this the well-instructed Miss Compton, whose heraldic lore was quite sufficient to enable her with perfect accuracy to blazon her own arms, had her lozenge painted in miniature; which being all that was required to render the neat equipage complete, this portion of their preparation did not cause any delay. To Miss Peters Agnes wrote of all the unexpected good which had befallen her, with much freer confidence than she could indulge in when addressing the relations of Colonel Hubert. Her friend Mary already knew the name of Miss Compton of Compton Basset, and no fear of appearing boastful rendered it necessary for her to conceal how strangely the aspect of her worldly affairs was changed. To her and her good-natured mother was confided the task of choosing lodgings for them, and so ably was this performed, that exactly in 1 fortnight and 3 days from the time Colonel Hubert had left Agnes so miserably alone in Mrs. Barnaby's melancholy lodgings in Half Moon Street, she was established in airy and handsome apartments in the Mall of Clifton, with every comfort and elegance about her that thoughtful and ingenious affection could suggest to make the contrast more striking. The happiness of this meeting with the kind friends who had conceived so warm an affection for her, even when presented by Mrs. Barnaby, was in just proportion to the hopeless sadness with which she had bid them farewell; and the reception of her munificent aunt among them, with the cordial good understanding which mutually ensued, did all that fate and fortune could do to atone for the suffering endured since they had parted. End of chapter 8. Volume 3, Chapter 9 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Brings us back, as it ought, to Mrs. Barnaby. It may be thought, perhaps, that the vexed, and as she thought herself, the persecuted Mrs. Barnaby, had sufficiently tried what a prison was to prevent her ever desiring to find herself within the walls of such an edifice again. But such an opinion, however likely to be right, was nevertheless wrong; for no sooner had the widow recovered from the fit of rage into which the triumphant exit of Miss Compton had thrown her, and settled herself on her solitary sofa, with no better comforter or companion than a cup of tea modified with sky-blue milk, than the following soliloquy, though she gave it not breath, passed through her brain. "So here I am, then, after 6 months' trial of the travelling system, and a multitude of experiments in fashionable society, just £700 poorer than when I set out, and without having advanced a single inch towards a second marriage. This will never do. My youth, my beauty, and my fortune will all melt away together before the object is obtained, unless I change my plans and find some better mode of proceeding." Here Mrs. Barnaby sipped her vile tea, opened her work-box that she had been constrained to leave so hastily, ascertained that the exquisite collar she was working had received no injury during her absence, and then resumed her meditations. "Hey ho! It is most horribly dull, sitting in this way all by oneself. Even that good-for-nothing, stupid, ungrateful Agnes was better to look at than nothing. And even in that horrid fleet there was some pleasure in knowing that there was an elegant, interesting man to be met in a passage now and then, whose eyes spoke plainly enough what he thought of me. Poor fellow! His being in misfortune ought not to produce ill will to him in a generous mind. How he looked as he said 'Adieu, then, madam. With you vanishes the last ray of light that will ever reach my heart.' And I am sure he said exactly what he felt, and no more. Poor O'Donagough! My heart aches for him." And here she fell into a very piteous and sentimental mood indeed. Had her soliloquy been spoken out loud, as words could utter it, nobody would have heard a syllable about love, marriage, or any such nonsense. Her heart was at this time altogether given up to pity, compassion, and a deep sense of the duties of a Christian; and before she went to bed she had reasoned herself very satisfactorily into the conviction that, as a tender-hearted woman and a believer, it was her bounden duty, now that she had got out of trouble herself, to return to the Fleet for the purpose of once more seeing Mr. O'Donagough, and inquiring whether it was in her power to do anything to serve him before she left London. Nothing more surely tends to soothe the spirits and calm the agitated nerves than an amiable and pious resolution, taken as this was done, during the last waning hours of the day, and just before the languid body lays itself down to rest. Mrs. Barnaby slept like a top after coming to the determination that, let the turnkeys think what they would of it, she would call at the Fleet Prison, and ask to see Mr. O'Donagough the next morning. The following morning came, and found the benevolent widow steadfast in her purpose; and yet, to her honour be it spoken, it was not without some struggles with a feeling which many might have called shame, but which she conscientiously condemned as pride, that she set forth at length upon her adventurous expedition. "Nothing, I am sure," it was thus she reasoned with herself, "nothing in the world could induce me to take such a step, but a feeling that it was my duty. Heaven knows I have had many follies in my day, I don't deny it. I am no hardened sinner, and that blessed book that he lent me has not been a pearl thrown to swine. The Sinner's Reward. What a comforting title! I don't hope ever to be the saint that the pious author describes, but I'm sure I shall be a better woman all my life for reading it. And the visiting this poor O'Donagough is the first act by which I can prove the good it has done me." Then came some doubts and difficulties respecting the style of toilette which she ought to adopt on so peculiar an occasion. It won't do for a person looking like a woman of fashion to drive up to the Fleet Prison, and ask to see such a man as O'Donagough. He is too young and handsome to make it respectable. But after all, What does it signify what people say? And as for my bonnet, I'll just put my Brussels lace veil on my black and pink. That will hide my ringlets and make me look more matronly." In her deep lace veil, then, and with a large silk cloak which concealed the becoming gaiety of her morning dress, Mrs. Barnaby presented herself before the gate she had so lately passed, and in a very demure voice said to the keeper of it, "I wish to be permitted to see Mr. O'Donagough." The fellow looked at her and smiled. "Well, madam," he replied, "I believe there will be no difficulty about that. Walk on, if you please. You'll find them as can send you forward." A few more barriers passed, and a few more well-amused turnkeys propitiated, and Mrs. Barnaby stood before a door which she knew as well as any of them opened upon the solitary abode of the broken-hearted but elegant Mr. O'Donagough. The door was thrown open for her to enter, but she paused, desiring her usher to deliver her card first, with an intimation that she wished to speak to the gentleman on business. She was not kept long in suspense, for the voice of the solitary inmate was heard from within, saying in soft and melancholy accents, "It is very heavenly kindness. Beg her to walk in." And in she walked, the room door being immediately closed behind her. Mr. O'Donagough was a very handsome man of about 30 years of age, with a physiognomy and cerebral development which might have puzzled Dr. Combe himself; for impressions left by the past were so evidently fading away before the active operation of the present, that to say distinctly from the examining eye or the examining finger what manner of man he was would have been exceedingly difficult. But the powers of the historian and biographer are less limited, and their record shall be given. Mr. Patrick O'Donagough was but a half-breed, and that a mongrel half, of the noble species which his names announce. He was the natural son of an Englishman of wealth and consequence by a poor Irish girl called Nora O'Donagough; and though his father did what was considered by many as very much for him, he never permitted him to assume his name. The young O'Donagough was placed as a clerk to one of the police magistrates of the metropolis, and showed great ability in the readiness with which he soon executed the business that passed through his hands. He not only learned to know by sight every rogue and roguess that appeared at the office, but showed a very uncommon degree of sagacity as to their innocence or guilt upon every new occasion that enforced their appearance there. His noble father never entirely lost sight of him, and finding his abilities so remarkable, he was induced again to use his interest in those quarters where influence abides, and to get him promoted to a lucrative situation in a custom house on the coast, where he made money rapidly, while his handsome person and good address gave him access to the society of many people greatly his superiors in station, who most of them were frequenting a fashionable watering place at no great distance from the station where he was employed. This lasted for a few years, much to the satisfaction of his illustrious parent; and it might have continued till an easy fortune was assured to him, had he not unluckily formed too great an intimacy with one or two vastly gentlemanlike but decidedly sporting characters. From this point his star began to descend, till, step by step, he had lost his money, his appointment, his father's favour, and his own freedom. Having lain in prison for debt during some weeks, he found means again to touch the heart of his father so effectually as to induce him to pay his debts and restore him to freedom, upon condition, however, of his immediately setting off for Australia with £500 in his pocket, and with the understanding that he was never more to return. The promise was given, and the £500 received; but the young man was not proof against temptation. He met some old acquaintance, lost half his money at écarté, and permitted the vessel in which he was to sail to depart without him. This was a moment of low spirits and great discouragement, but he felt, nevertheless, that a steadfast heart and bold spirit might bring a man out of as bad a scrape even as that into which he had fallen. Some people told him to apply again to his father, but he thought he had better not, and he applied to a gentleman with whom he had made acquaintance in prison instead. This person had, like himself, been reduced to great distress by the turf; but having fortunately found means of satisfying the creditor at whose suit he was detained, he was now doing exceedingly well as preacher to an independent congregation of ranting fanatics. He bestowed on his old associate some excellent advice as to his future principles and conduct, giving him to understand that the turf, even to those who were the most fortunate, never answered so well as the line of business he now followed, and assured him, moreover, that if he would forthwith commence an assiduous study of the principles and practice of the profession, he would himself lend him a helping hand to turn it to account. O'Donagough loved change, novelty, and excitement, and again manifested great talent in the facility with which he mastered the mysteries of this new business. He was soon seen rapidly advancing towards lasting wealth and independence. One of the wealthiest merchants in London had offered him the place of domestic prayer and preacher at his beautiful residence at Castaway Saved Park, when an almost forgotten creditor, who had lost sight of him for many years, unluckily recognised him as he was delivering a most awakening evening lecture in a large ware-room converted into a chapel near Moor Fields. Eager to take advantage of this unexpected piece of good fortune, the tailor, for such was his profession, arrested the inspired orator in the first place, and then asked him if he were able to settle his account in the next. Had the manner of transacting the business been reversed, it is probable that the affair would have been settled without any arrest at all. For Sir Miles Morris, of Castaway Saved Park, was one of the most pious individuals of the age, and would hardly have permitted his chaplain-elect, elect in every sense, to have gone to prison for £37, 9s. and 8d. But being in prison, O'Donagough was shy of mentioning the circumstance to his distinguished patron, and was employed, at the time Mrs. Barnaby first made acquaintance with him, in composing discourses on the preternatural powers over the human mind, accorded to the chosen vessels called upon to pour out the doctrine of the new birth to the people. There is little doubt that these really eloquent compositions would have sold rapidly, and perfectly have answered the object of their clever author. But accident prevented the trial from being made, for before the projected volume was more than half finished, success of another kind overtook Mr. O'Donagough. Mrs. Barnaby, on entering, found the poor prisoner she had so charitably come to visit seated at a writing-desk, with many sheets of closely written manuscript about it. He rose as she entered, and approached her with a judicious mixture of respectful deference and ardent gratitude. "May Heaven reward you, madam, for this blessed proof of Christian feeling. How can I suitably speak my gratitude?" "I do assure you, Mr. O'Donagough, that you are quite right in thinking that I come wholly and solely from a Christian spirit, and a wish to do my duty," said Mrs. Barnaby. Mr. O'Donagough looked extremely handsome as he answered with a melancholy smile, "Alas, madam, what other motive could the whole world offer, excepting obedience to the will of Heaven, sufficiently strong to bring such a person as I now look upon voluntarily within these fearful walls?" "That is very true indeed. There is nothing else that could make one do it. Heaven knows I suffered too much when I was here myself to feel any inclination for returning. But I thought, Mr. O'Donagough, that it would be very unfeeling in me, who witnessed your distress, to turn my back upon you when my own troubles are past and over. And so I am come, Mr. O'Donagough, to ask if I can be of any use to you in any way before I set off upon my travels, for I intend to make a tour to France, and perhaps to Rome." The widow looked at Mr. O'Donagough's eyes to see how he took the news, for somehow or other she could not help fancying that the poor young man would feel more forlorn and miserable still, when he heard that not only the walls of the Fleet Prison, but the English Channel, was to divide them; nor did the expression of the eyes she thus examined lessen this idea. A settled, gentle melancholy seemed to rise from his heart, and peep out upon her through these windows of the soul. To France, to Rome! A deep sigh followed, and for a minute or two the young man remained with his eyes mournfully fixed on her face. He then rose up, and stepping across the narrow space occupied by the table that stood between them, he took her hand, and in a deep, sweet voice, that almost seemed breaking into a sob, he said, "May you be happy whithersoever you go. My prayers shall follow you. My ardent prayers shall be unceasingly breathed to Heaven for your safety, and my blessing, my fervent, tender blessing, shall hover round you as you go." Mrs. Barnaby was exceedingly affected. "Don't speak so, pray don't speak so, Mr. O'Donagough," she said in a voice which gave her very good reason to believe that tears were coming. "I am sure I would pray for you too when I am far away, if it would do you any good," and here one of her worked pocket handkerchiefs was really drawn out and applied to her eyes. "If, Mrs. Barnaby," exclaimed the young man fervently, "if — oh, do not doubt it, do not for a moment doubt that I should feel the influence of it in every nerve. Let me teach you to understand me, Mrs. Barnaby, for I have made an examination into the effects of spiritual sympathies the subject of much study. Lay your hand upon my heart, nay, let it rest there for a moment, and you will be able to comprehend what I would explain to you. Does not that poor heart beat and throb, Mrs. Barnaby? And think you that it would have fluttered thus had you not said that you would pray for me? Then can you doubt that if indeed you should still remember the unhappy O'Donagough as you pursue your jocund course o'er hill and vale, if indeed you should breathe a prayer to heaven for his welfare, can you doubt that it will fall upon him like the soft fanning of a seraph's wing, and heal the tumult of his soul e'en in this dungeon?" There was so much apparent sincerity as well as tenderness in what the young man uttered, that a feeling of conviction at once found its way to the understanding of Mrs. Barnaby; and little doubt, if any, remained on her mind as to the efficacy of her prayers. "Indeed, Mr. O'Donagough, I will pray for you then. And I'm sure I should be a very wicked wretch if I did not. But is there nothing else I could do to comfort you?" Mr. O'Donagough had often found his handsome and expressive countenance of great service to him, and so he did now. No answer he could have given in words to this kind question could have produced so great effect as the look with which he received it. Mrs. Barnaby was fluttered, agitated, and did not quite know what to do or say next. But Mr. O'Donagough did. He rose from his chair, and raising his arms above his head to their utmost length, he passionately clasped his hands and stood thus, his fine eyes communing with the ceiling, just long enough to give the widow time to be aware that he certainly was the very handsomest young man in the world, and then he drew his chair close beside her, took her hand, and fixed those fine eyes very particularly upon hers. "Comfort me," he murmured in a soft whisper, which had it not been breathed very close to her ear would probably have been lost. "Comfort me? You ask if you could comfort me? Oh, earth, oh, heaven, bear witness, as I swear, that to trace one single movement of pity on that lovely face would go farther towards healing every sorrow of my soul than all the wealth that Plutus could pour on me, though it should come in ingots of gold heavy enough to break the chains that hold me." "Oh, Mr. O'Donagough!" was all Mrs. Barnaby could utter, but she turned her face away, nor was the fascinating prisoner again indulged with a full view of it, though he endeavoured to make his eyes follow the way hers led, till he dropped down on his knees before her, and by taking possession of both her hands, enabled himself to pursue his interesting speculations upon its expression, in spite of all she could do to prevent it. This brought the business for which Mrs. Barnaby came, namely, the inquiry into what she could do to be serviceable to Mr. O'Donagough before she left London, to a very speedy termination. For with this fair index of what he might say before his eyes, the enterprising prisoner ventured to hint that nothing would so effectually soothe his sorrows as the love of the charming being who had already expressed such melting pity for him. He moreover made it manifest that if she would, with the noble confidence which he was sure made a part of her admirable character, lend him wherewithal to liquidate the paltry debt for which he had been so treacherously arrested, he could find means again to interest his noble father in his behalf, and by giving him such a guarantee for his future steadiness as an honourable attachment was always sure to offer, he should easily induce him to renew his intention of fitting him out handsomely for an expedition to Australia, to which, as he confessed, he was more strongly inclined than even to persevere in listening to the call he had received to the ministry. Notwithstanding the tender agitation into which such a conversation must inevitably throw every lady who would listen to it, Mrs. Barnaby did not so completely lose her presence of mind as not to remember that it would be better to look about her a little before she positively promised to marry and accompany to Australia the captivating young man who knelt at her feet. But this praiseworthy degree of caution did not prevent her from immediately deciding upon granting him the loan he desired. Nay, with thoughtful kindness, she herself suggested that it might be more convenient to make the sum lent £40 instead of £37 9s. 8d., and having said this with a look and manner the most touching, she at length induced Mr. O'Donagough to rise; and after a few such expressions of tender gratitude as the occasion called for, they parted, the widow promising to deliver to him with her own fair hands on the morrow the sum necessary for his release; while he, as he fervently kissed her hand, declared, that deeply as he felt this generous kindness, he should wish it had never been extended to him, unless the freedom thus regained were rendered dear to his soul by her sharing it with him. "Give me time, dear O'Donagough, give me time to think of this startling proposal, and to-morrow we will meet again," were the words in which she replied to him, and then, permitting herself for one moment to return the tender glances he threw after her, she opened the room door and passed through it, too much engrossed by her own thoughts, hopes, wishes, and speculations, to heed the variety of amusing grimaces by which the various turnkeys hailed her regress through them. It would be unreasonable for any one to desire better sympathy than that which existed between my heroine and Mr. O'Donagough, when they thus tore themselves asunder; he remaining in durance vile till such time as fate or love should release him, and she to throw herself into a hackney coach, there to meditate on the pleasures and the pains either promised or threatened by the proposal she had just received. The sympathy lay in this, that both parties were determined to inform themselves very particularly of the worldly condition of the other, before they advanced one step farther towards matrimony, for which state, though the gentleman had spoken with rapture, and the lady had listened with softness, both had too proper a respect to think of entering upon it unadvisedly. End of chapter 9. Volume 3, Chapters 10 and 11 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Gives some account of Colonel Hubert's return to Cheltenham. We must now follow Colonel Hubert to Cheltenham, to which place he returned in a state of mind not particularly easy to be described. The barrier he had placed before his heart, the heavy pressure of which he had sometimes felt to be intolerable, was now broken down, and it was a relief to him to remember that Agnes knew of his love. But, excepting this relief, there was little that could be felt as consolatory, and much that was decidedly painful in his state of mind. He knew but too well that not all the partial affection, esteem, and admiration entertained for him by his aunt, would prevent her feeling and expressing the most violent aversion to his marrying the niece of Mrs. Barnaby. He knew, too, what sort of reception the avowal of such an intention was likely to meet from his amiable but proud brother-in-law, and remembered, with feelings not very closely allied to satisfaction, the charge he had commissioned Lady Stephenson to give him, that he should keep watch over his thoughtless young brother, in order to guard him, if possible, from bringing upon them the greatest misfortune that could befall a family such as theirs, namely, the introducing an inferior connection into it. Neither could he forget the influence he had used, in consequence of this injunction, to crush the ardent, generous, uncalculating attachment of his confiding friend Frederick for her whom, in defiance of the wishes of his whole family, he was now fully determined to make his wife. All this gave materials for very painful meditation, and when, in addition to it, he recalled those fearful words of Agnes, "I will never be your wife," it required all the power of that master passion which had seized upon his heart to keep him steady to his resolution of communicating his wishes and intentions to Lady Elizabeth, and to sustain his hopes of engaging her actively to assist him in obtaining what he felt very sure she would earnestly desire that he should never possess. With all these heavy thoughts working within him, he entered the drawing-room of his aunt, and rejoiced to find her tete-a-tete with his sister, Sir Edward being absent at a dinner-party of gentlemen. They both welcomed him with eager inquiries concerning their young favourite, the tone of which at once determined him to enter immediately upon the tremendous subject of his hopes and wishes, and the affectionate interest expressed for her warmed him into a degree of confidence which he was far from feeling when he entered the room. "Pretty creature!" exclaimed Lady Elizabeth, "and that wretched woman has actually left her alone in London lodgings. Why did you not make her return with you, Montague? It was surely no time to stand upon etiquette." "I dared not even ask it," replied Colonel Hubert, his voice faltering, and his manner such as to make the two ladies exchange a hasty glance with each other. "You dared not ask Agnes Willoughby, poor little thing, to come down with you to my house, Colonel Hubert," said the old lady. "You surely forget that you went up to London with an invitation for her in your pocket." "My dear aunt," replied Colonel Hubert, hesitating in his speech, as neither of his auditors had ever before heard him hesitate, "I have much to tell you respecting both Agnes Willoughby and myself." "Then tell it in heaven's name," said Lady Elizabeth sharply. "Let it be what it may, I would rather hear it than be kept hanging thus by the ears between the possible and impossible." Colonel Hubert moved his chair, and seating himself beside Lady Stephenson, took her hand, as if to show that she too was to listen to what he was about to say, though it was their aunt to whom he addressed himself. From suspense at least I can relieve you, Lady Elizabeth, and you too, my dear Emily, who look at me so anxiously without saying a word. At least I can relieve you from suspense. I love Miss Willoughby, and I hope, with as little delay as possible, to make her my wife." Lady Stephenson pressed his hand and said nothing, but a deep sigh escaped her. Lady Elizabeth, who was not accustomed to manifest her feelings so gently, rose from her seat on the sofa, and placing herself immediately before him, said, with great vehemence, "Montague Hubert, son of my dead sister, you are come to years of discretion, and a trifle beyond. Your magnificent estate of 1,300 a year, and, I beg your pardon, some odd pounds, shillings, and pence over is all your own, and you may marry Mrs. Barnaby herself, if you please, and settle it upon her. No one living that I know of has any power to prevent it. But, sir, if you expect that Lady Elizabeth Norris will ever receive as her niece a girl artful enough to conceal from me and from your sister the fact that she was engaged to you, and that too, while receiving from both of us the most flattering attention, nay, such affection as might have opened any heart not made of brass and steel, if you expect this, you will find yourself altogether mistaken." This harangue, which her ladyship intended to be overpoweringly severe, was, in fact, very nearly the most agreeable one that Colonel Hubert could have listened to, for it touched only on a subject of offence that he was perfectly able to remove. All embarrassment immediately disappeared from his manner, and springing up to place himself between his aunt and the door, to which she was approaching with stately steps, he said in a voice almost of exultation, "My dearest aunt, how like your noble self it is to have made this objection before every other; and this objection, which would indeed have been fatal to every hope of my happiness, I can remove by a single word. Agnes was as ignorant of my love for her as you and Emily could be till last night. I have loved her, longer it may be than I have known it myself. Perhaps I might date it from the first hour I saw her, but she knew nothing of it. Last night, for the first time, I confessed to her my love. And what think you, Lady Elizabeth, was her answer?" "Nay, Mr. Benedict, I know not. I thank you, sir, and a low courtesy, I suppose." "I was less happy, Lady Elizabeth," he replied, half smiling, adding a moment later, however, with a countenance from which all trace of gaiety had passed away. "The answer of Miss Willoughby to my offer of marriage was, 'Colonel Hubert, I can never be your wife.'" "Indeed? Then how comes it, Montague, that you still talk of making her so?" "Because before I left her I thought I saw some ground for hope that her refusal was not caused by any personal dislike to me." "Really?" interrupted Lady Elizabeth. "Nay, my dear aunt," resumed Hubert, "you may, in your kind and long-enduring partiality, fancy this impossible, but unhappily for my peace of that moment, I remembered that I was more than 35, and she not quite 18. "But she told you, I suppose, that you were still a very handsome fellow. Only she had some other objection. And pray what was it, sir?" "She feared the connection would be displeasing to you and Lady Stephenson." "And you assured her most earnestly, perhaps, that she was mistaken?" "No, Lady Elizabeth, I did not. There are circumstances in her position that must make my marrying her appear objectionable to my family, and though my little independence is, as your ladyship observes, my own, I would not wish to share it with any woman who would be indifferent to their reception of her. All my hope, therefore, rests in the confidence I feel that, when the first unpleasing surprise of this avowal shall have passed away, you, both of you, for there is no one else whose approbation I should wait for, you will suffer your hearts and heads to strike a fair and reasonable balance between all that my sweet Agnes has in her favour and all she has against her. Do this, Lady Elizabeth, but do it as kindly as you can. Emily will help you. Tomorrow morning you shall tell me your decision. I can resolve on nothing till I hear it." Colonel Hubert, as soon as he had said this, left the room, nor did they see him again that night. The morning came, and he met Lady Stephenson at the breakfast table, but Lady Elizabeth did not appear, sending down word, as was not unusual with her, that she should take her chocolate in her own room. Sir Edward was not in the room when he entered, and he seized the opportunity to utter a hasty and abrupt inquiry as to the answer he might expect from herself and their aunt. "From me, Montague," she replied, you cannot fear to hear anything very harshly disagreeable. In truth, I have been so long accustomed to believe that whatever my brother did or wished to do was wisest, best, that it would be very difficult for me to think otherwise now. Besides, I cannot deny, though perhaps it hardly ought to be taken into the account, that I too am very much in love with Agnes Willoughby, and that, though I would give my little finger she had no aunt Barnaby belonging to her, I never saw any woman in any rank whom I could so cordially love and welcome as a sister." In reply to this, Colonel Hubert clasped the lovely speaker to his heart, and before he had released her from his embrace, or repeated his inquiry concerning Lady Elizabeth, Sir Edward Stephenson entered, and the conversation became general. For many hours of that irksome morning Colonel Hubert was kept in the most tantalizing state of suspense by the prolonged absence of the old lady from the drawing-room. But at length, after Sir Edward and his lady had set off for their second morning ramble without him, he was cheered by the appearance of the ancient maiden, who was his aunt's tirewoman, bringing in her lap-dog and the velvet cushion that was its appendage; which having placed reverently before the fire, she moved the favourite fauteuil an inch one way, and the little table that ever stood beside it an inch the other, and was retiring, when Colonel Hubert said, "Is my aunt coming immediately, Mitchell?" "My lady will not be long, Colonel, but her ladyship is very poorly this morning," and with a graceful swinging courtesy she withdrew. The Colonel trembled all over, very poorly, as applied to Lady Elizabeth Norris, having from his earliest recollection always been considered as synonymous to very cross. "She will refuse to see her," thought he, pacing the room in violent agitation, "and in that case she will keep her word. She will never be my wife." "Bless me, how you do shake the room, Colonel Hubert," said a very crabbed voice behind him, just after he had passed the door in his perturbed promenade. "If you took such a fancy early in the morning, when the housemaid might sweep up the dust you had raised, I should not object to it, for it is very like having one's carpet beat. But just as I am coming to sit down here, it is very disagreeable indeed." This grumble lasted just long enough to allow the old lady, who looked as if she had been eating crab apples and walked as if she had suddenly been seized with the gout in all her joints, to place herself in her easy chair as she concluded it, during which time the Colonel stood still upon the hearth rug, with his eyes anxiously fixed upon the venerable but very hostile features that were approaching him. A moment's silence followed, during which the old lady looked up in his face with the most provoking expression imaginable; for, cross as it was, there was a glance of playful malice in it that seemed to say, "You look as if you were going to cry, Colonel." He felt provoked with her, and this gave him courage. "May I beg of you, Lady Elizabeth, to tell me what I may hope from your kindness on the subject I mentioned to you last night?" said he. "Pray, sir, do you remember your grandfather?" was her reply. "The Earl of Archdale? Yes, madam, perfectly." "You do? Humph. And your paternal grandfather, with his pedigree from Duke Nigel of Normandy, did you ever hear of him?" "Yes, Lady Elizabeth," replied the Colonel, in a tone of indifference. "I have heard of him, but he died, you know, when I was very young." There was a minute's silence, which was broken by another question from Lady Elizabeth. "And pray, sir, will you do me the favour to tell me who was the grandfather of Miss Willoughby?" "I have little, or indeed no doubt, Lady Elizabeth, that Miss Willoughby is the granddaughter of that Mr. Willoughby of Greatfield Park, in Warwickshire, who lost the tremendous stake at piquet that you have heard of, and two of whose daughters married the twin sons of Lord Eastcombe. I think you cannot have forgotten the circumstances." Lady Elizabeth drew herself forward in her chair, and fixing her eyes steadfastly on the face of her nephew, said, in a voice of great severity, "Do you mean to assert to me, Colonel Montague Hubert, that Agnes Willoughby is niece to Lady Eastcombe and the Honourable Mrs. Knivet?" "I mean to assert to you, madam, that it is my firm persuasion that such will prove to be the fact. But I have not considered it necessary, Lady Elizabeth Norris, for the son of my father to withhold his affections from the chosen of his heart, till he was assured he should gain all the honour by the selection which a union with Lady Eastcombe's niece could bestow. Nor should I have mentioned my belief in this connection by way of a set-off to the equally near claim of Mrs. Barnaby, had you not questioned me so particularly." Had Colonel Hubert studied his answer for a 12-month, he could not have composed a more judicious one. There was a spice of hauteur in it by no means uncongenial to the old lady's feelings, and there was, too, enough of defiance to make her take counsel with herself as to whether it would be wise to vex him further. It was therefore less with the accent of mockery, and more with that of curiosity, that she recommenced her interrogatory. " Will you tell me, Montague, from what source you derive this knowledge of Miss Willoughby's family? Was it from herself?" " Certainly not. If the facts be as I have stated, and as I hope and believe they will be found, Miss Willoughby will be as much surprised by the discovery as your ladyship." " From whom, then, did you hear it?" " From no one, Lady Elizabeth, as a matter of fact connected with Agnes. But something, I know not what, introduced the mention of old Willoughby's wild stake at piquet at the club the other day. The name struck me, and I led old Major Barnes to talk to me of the family. He told me that a younger son, a gay harum-scarum sort of youth, married some girl when he was in country quarters, whom his family would not receive; that ruined and broken-hearted by this desertion, he went abroad almost immediately after his marriage, and has never been heard of since." " And this is the foundation upon which you build your hope, that Mrs. Barnaby's niece is also the niece of Lady Eastcombe? Ingenious, certainly, Colonel, as a theory, but somewhat slight as an edifice on which to hang any weighty matter. Don't you think so?" " I hang nothing on it, Lady Elizabeth. If I did not feel that Miss Willoughby was calculated to make me happy without this supposed relationship, I certainly should not think her so with it. However, that your ladyship may not fancy my imagination more fertile than it really is, I must add, that when at Clifton I did hear from the Mrs. Peters, whom I have before mentioned to you, that the father of Agnes went abroad after his marriage, and moreover that no news of him in any way ever reached his wife's family afterwards." Lady Elizabeth for some time made no reply, but seemed to ponder upon this statement very earnestly. At length she said in a tone from which irony and harshness, levity and severity, were equally banished, " Montague, there are some of the feelings which you have just expressed in which I cannot sympathize, but a very little reflection will teach you that there is no ground of offence to you in this, for it would be unnatural that I should do so. You tell me that your father's son need not deem the honour of a relationship to Viscountess Eastcombe necessary to his happiness in life. So far I am able to comprehend you, although Lady Eastcombe is an honourable and excellent personage, whose near connection with a young lady would be no contemptible advantage, at least in my mind, upon her introduction into life. But we will pass this. When, however, you proceed to tell me that your choice in marriage could in no wise be affected by the rank and station of those with whom it might bring you in contact, and that, too, when the question is whether a Mrs. Barnaby or a Lady Eastcombe should be in the foreground of the group, you must excuse me if I cannot follow you. Nothing is so distressing in an argument as to have a burst of grandiloquent sentiment set aside by a few words of common sense. Colonel Hubert walked the length of the drawing room and back again before he answered. He felt that, as his aunt put the case, he was as far from following his assertion by his judgment as herself; but ere his walk was finished, the image of the desolate Agnes, as he had seen her the night before, arose before him, and resumed its unconquerable influence on his heart. He took a hint from her ladyship, threw aside all mixture of heat and anger, and replied, "Heaven forbid, Lady Elizabeth, that I should attempt to defend any such doctrine. Believe me, it is not mine. But in one word, I love Miss Willoughby, and if I can arrive at the happiness of believing that I am loved in return, nothing but her own refusal will prevent me from marrying her. This is my statement of facts. I will attempt no other, and throw myself wholly upon your judgment to smooth or render more rugged the path which lies before me." The old lady looked at him and smiled very kindly. "Montague," said she, "resolve my doubts. Is it the mention of your pleasant suspicions respecting Miss Willoughby's paternal ancestry, or your present unvarnished frankness, that has won upon me? Upon my honour, I could not answer this question myself; but certain it is that I do feel more inclined to remember what a very sweet creature Agnes is at this moment, than I ever thought I should again when our conversation began." Colonel Hubert kneeled down upon her footstool, and kissing her hand, said in a voice that spoke his happiness, "It matters not to me what the cause is, my dearest aunt. I thank Heaven for the effect. And now, do not think that I am taking an unfair advantage of this kindness, if I ask you to remember the position of Miss Willoughby at this moment. With such views for the future as I have explained to you, is it not my duty to remove her from it?" "What then do you propose to do?" demanded Lady Elizabeth. "I can do nothing," he replied. "Whatever aid or protection can be extended to her must come from you, or Lady Stephenson, and that I should rather it came from you, who have long been to me as a mother, can hardly surprise you. Sir Edward is an excellent young man, but he has prejudices that I should not like to battle with on this occasion. It is from you, and you only, Lady Elizabeth, that I either hope or wish to find protection for my future wife." Again Lady Elizabeth pondered. "Did not Agnes tell us," she said at length, "did she not say in her letter to Lady Stephenson that she had applied to some aged relation in Devonshire by whom she hoped to be extricated from her present terrible embarrassment?" "It is very likely," replied Colonel Hubert, "for she spoke to me of such a one, and hoped that Thursday, that is tomorrow, is it not, would bring an answer to her application." "Then, Montague, we must wait to hear what this Thursday brings forth, before we interfere to repeat the offer of protection, which it is possible she may not want. And Heaven grant it may be so. For if she is to be your wife, Colonel Hubert, and it is pretty plain she will it not be better that you should follow her with your addresses to the lowliest roof in Devonshire, than that she should take refuge here, where every gossip's finger will be pointed at her?" It was impossible to deny the truth of this, and Colonel Hubert cared not to avow that all the favour she had bid him hope for was but conditional, and that till the avowal of his love should be sanctioned by his aunt and sister he was still to hold himself as a rejected man. He dared not tell her this, lest the feelings he had conquered with so much difficulty should return, upon learning that it was not yet too late to encourage them. As patiently as he could, therefore, he awaited the expected letter from Agnes, and well was he rewarded for doing so. The letter itself, modest and unboastful as it was, gave a sufficiently improved picture of her condition to remove all present anxiety on her account; and though he certainly had no idea of the transformation she had undergone, from a heart-broken, penniless dependent, into a petted, cherished heiress, he was soothed into the belief that it would now cost his aunt and sister infinitely less pain than he had anticipated, to extend such a degree of favour to his Agnes as might lead her to confirm the hope on which he lived. But it was not the letter of Agnes that produced the most favourable impression upon Lady Elizabeth. The postscript of Miss Compton was infinitely more powerful in its effect upon her mind. Of Agnes personally she never thought without a degree of partial admiration that nearly approached to affection; and vague as the hope was respecting the family of her father, it clung very pertinaciously to the old lady's memory, while a certain resemblance, which she felt sure that she could trace between the nose of Agnes and that of the Honourable Miss Knivet, Lord Eastcombe's eldest daughter, was doing wonders in her mind by way of a balance weight against the rouge and ringlets of Mrs. Barnaby. Yet, nevertheless, the notion that not horrid Mrs. Barnaby only, but a host of aunts and cousins of the same breed might come down upon her in the event of this ill-assorted marriage, kept her in a sort of feverish wavering state, something between good and ill humour, that was exceedingly annoying to her nephew. The keen-sighted old lady at once perceived that the postscript to Agnes's letter was not written by a second Mrs. Barnaby, and from that moment she determined, much more decisively than she chose to express, that she would torment Colonel Hubert with no farther opposition. After a short consultation between the aunt and niece, that letter was dispatched, the receipt of which was mentioned before Miss Compton and Agnes left London for Clifton. Had Colonel Hubert been consulted upon it, he would perhaps have suggested as an improvement that the proposed meeting should take place the following week in London, but on the whole the composition was too satisfactory for him to venture upon any alteration of it, and again he called patience to his aid, while many miserably long days were wasted by the very slow and deliberate style in which the man and maid servant who managed all Lady Elizabeth's worldly concerns set about preparing themselves and her for this removal. It was with a degree of pleasure which almost atoned for the vexation of this delay, that he learned Sir Edward's good-natured compliance with his beautiful bride's capricious-seeming wish of revisiting Clifton. Colonel Hubert pertinaciously refused to let his gay brother-in-law into his confidence, till the time arrived for presenting him to Miss Willoughby as to his future wife. Did this reserve arise from some unacknowledged doubt whether Agnes, when the pressure of misfortune was withdrawn, would voluntarily bestow herself on a man of his advanced age? Perhaps so. That Agnes was less than 18, and himself more than 35, were facts repeated to himself too often for his tranquillity. CHAPTER XI. Agnes appears at Clifton in a new character. At as early an hour on the morning after her arrival at Clifton as Agnes could hope to find her friend Mary awake, she set off for Rodney Place. It was a short walk, but a happy one, even though she had yet to learn whether Lady Elizabeth Norris and her party were or were not arrived. But there was something at the bottom of her heart that made her very tolerably easy, more so perhaps than she confessed to herself on this point. Every day made the mysterious fact of Miss Compton's being a woman of handsome fortune more familiar to her, and every hour made it more clear that she had no other object in life than to make that fortune contribute to the happiness of her niece. It followed, therefore, that, not having altogether forgotten the fact of Colonel Hubert's declaration at a moment when all things but his own heart must have pleaded against her, some very comfortable ground for hope to rest upon was discoverable in the circumstances of her present position. There will be no danger, thought she, that when he speaks again, my answer should be such as to make him fancy himself too old for me. The servant at Rodney Place who opened the door to Agnes was the same who had done her the like service some dozen of times during her last visit at Clifton, but he betrayed no sign of recognition when she presented herself. In fact, the general appearance of Agnes was so greatly changed from what he had been accustomed to see it when she was clothed in the residuum of the widow Barnaby's weeds, that till she smiled and spoke her inquiry for Miss Peters, he had no recollection of her. As soon, however, as he discovered that it was the Miss Willoughby who had left all his ladies crying when she went away, he took care to make her perceive that she was not forgotten by the manner in which he said, "Miss Peters, ma'am, is not come down stairs yet, but she will be very happy to see you, ma'am, if you will please to walk up." As the early visitor was of the same opinion, she scrupled not to find her way to the well-known door, and without even the ceremony of a tap, presented herself to her friend. It is probable that Mary looked more at the face and less at the dress of the visitor than the servant had done, for uttering a cry of joy she sprang towards her, and most affectionately folded her in a cordial embrace. "My sweet Agnes, this is so like you. At the very instant you entered, I was calculating the probabilities between to-day and to-morrow for your arrival. Ah, little girl, did I not tell you to address yourself to Miss Compton of Compton Basset long ago? What say you to my wisdom now?" "That you were inspired, Mary, and that I deserved to suffer a good deal for not listening to such an oracle. But had I done so, I should never have known." "The difference between the extreme of Barnaby misery and Compton comfort," said Mary, finishing the sentence for her. Agnes blushed, but said with a happy smile, "Yes, assuredly I may say so." Miss Peters looked at her and laughed. "There is something else you would not have known, I am very sure, Agnes, by that conscious face, and it must be something very well worth knowing by that look of radiant happiness which I never saw on your face before. No, not even when for the first time you looked down upon Avon's dun stream; for then, if I remember rightly, your joy showed itself in tears. But now, my dear, you are dimpling with smiles, though I really believe you are doing all you can to hide them from me. Say, why is this? Wherefore? What should it mean?" "Mary, there is not an event of my life, nor a thought of my heart that I would wish to hide from you. But how can I begin telling you such very long and incredible stories as I have got to tell, just as you have finished dressing and are ready to go down to breakfast?" said Agnes. "Breakfast?" replied her friend. "I would rather go without breakfast for a month and not hear the beginning, middle, and end of all your adventures from the moment you left this house in crape and bombasine, with your cheeks as white as marble and your eyes full of tears, up to this present now, that you have entered it again in as elegant a morning toilette as London can furnish, with your cheeks full of dimples and your eyes dancing in your head with happiness, notwithstanding all your efforts to look demure. Come, sit down, Agnes, and tell me all." "Tell you all I will, depend upon it, but not now, dear Mary. Think of all your mother's kindness to me. Shall I sit here indulging in confidential gossip with you, instead of paying my compliments to her and the rest of the family in the breakfast room? No, positively no. So come downstairs with me directly, or I will go myself." "Aunt Compton is spoiling you, child, that is quite clear. You used to be obedient to my command, and ever ready to do as I desired, but now you lay down the law like a Lord Chancellor. Come along then, Miss Agnes, but remember that as soon as breakfast is over, I expect first to be taken to the Mall. Have I not got nice lodgings for you? and introduced to Miss Compton of Compton Basset, and then taken to our old seat on the rock, then and there to hear all that has befallen you." To this Agnes agreed, and they descended together. The interest and the pleasure that her entrance excited among the family group already assembled round the breakfast table was very gratifying to her. Mrs. Peters seemed hardly less delighted than Mary. The two girls kissed her affectionately, and gazed at her with as much admiration as astonishment, which is tantamount to saying that they admired her much. Good Mr. Peters welcomed her very cordially, and inquired with the most scrupulous politeness for the health of Mrs. Barnaby; and James told her very frankly that he was delighted to see her, and that she was 50 times handsomer than ever. The conversation that followed was perfectly frank on the part of Agnes, in all that related to the kindness of her aunt Compton, and the happiness she enjoyed from being under her care; but from delicacy to them she said as little as possible about Mrs. Barnaby, and from delicacy to herself made no mention whatever either of Colonel Hubert or his family. As soon as the breakfast was over, Mrs. Peters declared her intention of immediately waiting on Miss Compton; an attention to her aunt which Agnes welcomed with pleasure, though it still farther postponed the much wished for conversation with her friend Mary. The whole family declared their eagerness to be introduced to the old lady, of whom Miss Willoughby spoke with such enthusiasm; but as the discreet Mrs. Peters declared that at this first visit her eldest daughter only must accompany her, the rest yielded of necessity, and the three ladies set out together. "I expect to find this new aunt a much more agreeable personage, my dear Agnes, than your former chaperone, though she was my dear sister. But on one point I flatter myself I shall find them alike." "I hope this point of resemblance is not of much importance to your happiness, my dear Mrs. Peters," replied Agnes, "for if it be, you are in a bad way, since night and day are infinitely less unlike than my two aunts in all things." "Yes, but it is of great importance to my happiness, particularly for this evening, Agnes," replied Mrs. Peters. "The point of resemblance I want to find is in the trusting you to my care. We are going to a party this evening where I should particularly like to take you, and it will be impossible, you know, to arrange exchange of visits and manage that an invitation shall be sent and accepted by Aunt Compton on such very short notice. Do you think she will let you go with us?" "Ask her, my dear Mrs. Peters," replied Agnes with a very happy smile, "and see what she will say to it." "I will, if I do not find her too awful," was the answer. The manner in which Miss Compton received and entertained her visitors was a fresh source of surprise to Agnes. Though thinking very highly of her intellect, and even of her conversational powers, she had anticipated some symptoms of reserve and shyness on the introduction of so perfect a recluse to strangers. But nothing of the kind appeared. Miss Compton was pleased by the appearance and manner of both mother and daughter, and permitted them to perceive that she was so, rather with the easy flattering sort of courtesy with which a superior treats those whom he wishes should be pleased with him, than with any appearance of the mauvaise honte which might have been expected. Nor must this be condemned as unnatural, for it was, in fact, the inevitable result of the state of mind in which she had lived. With keen intellect, elastic animal spirits, and a position that places the owner of it fairly above the reach of annoyance from any one, an elevation, by the by, that a few of the great ones of the earth can boast, it is not an introduction to any ordinary society that can discompose the mind or agitate the manners. Mrs. Peters did not find Aunt Compton too awful, and therefore preferred her request, which, like every other that could have been made likely to promote the pleasure of Agnes, was not only graciously but gratefully complied with. A question being started as to the order in which the party should go, Mrs. Peters' carriage not being able to take them all at once, Miss Compton settled it by saying, "Agnes has her own carriage and servants here, but she must not go alone; and perhaps, if she calls at your house, Mrs. Peters, you will have the kindness to let her friend Mary accompany her, and permit her carriage to follow yours." This being settled, Mrs. Peters and her daughter rose to take leave, and Mary then hoped that Agnes, by returning with them, would at length give her the opportunity she so earnestly desired of hearing all she had to tell. But she was again disappointed, for when the young heiress asked her indulgent aunt whether she would not take advantage of the lovely morning to see some of the beauties of Clifton, she replied, "I should like nothing so well, Agnes, as to take a drive with you over the beautiful downs you talk of. Will you spare her to me for so long, Miss Peters?" "I think you deserve a little of her, Miss Compton," answered the young lady, "and with the hope of the evening before me, I will enter no protest against the morning drive." The mother and daughter then took their leave, and as they left the house they exchanged a glance that seemed to express mutual congratulation on the altered condition of their favourite. "Well, mamma, you will be rewarded this time for obeying my commands like a dutiful mother, and permitting me to make a pet of the sweet Agnes. There is nothing in the Barnaby style here. I was sure Miss Compton of Compton Basett must be good for something," said Mary. "If I may venture to hope, as I think I may," replied her mother, "that she will never be the means of bringing me in contact with my incomparable sister-in-law again, I may really thank you, saucy girl as you are, for having so taken the reins into your own hands. I delight in this Miss Compton. There is a racy originality about her that is very awakening. And as for your Agnes, what with her new young happiness, her graceful loveliness, now first seen to some advantage, her proud and pretty fondness for her aunt, and her natural joy at seeing us all again under circumstances so delightfully altered, I really do think she is the most enchanting creature I ever beheld." End of chapters 10 and 11. Volume 3, Chapter 12 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. A party. A meeting. Good, sometimes productive of evil. The superintending the toilette of Agnes for the party of that evening was a new and very delightful page in the history of the spinster of Compton Basett. The fondest mother dressing a fair daughter for her first presentation never watched the operations of the toilette more anxiously, and in her case there was a sort of personal triumph attending its success, that combined the joy of the accomplished artist, who sees the finished loveliness himself has made with the fond approval of affection. Partly from her own native good taste, and partly from the wisdom of listening with a very discriminating judgment to the practical counsels of an experienced modiste, the dress of Agnes was exactly what it ought to have been, and the proud old lady herself could not have desired an appearance more distinguee than that of her adopted child when, turning from Peggy and her mirror, she made a sportive courtesy, and exclaimed, "Have you not made a fine lady of me, Aunt Betsy?" When Miss Compton's carriage stopped at Rodney Place, it was Mrs. Peters instead of her daughter who took a place in it. "Mary is excessively angry with me," said she as they drove off, "for not letting her be your companion. But I think it more comme il faut, Agnes, that I should present you to Mrs. Pemberton myself. She is a vastly fine lady, not one of us humble Bristolian Cliftonites, who pique ourselves rather upon the elevation of our limestone rock above the level of the stream that laves our merchants' quays, than on any other species of superiority that we can lay claim to. Mrs. Pemberton is none of us. She has a house in London and a park in Buckinghamshire, and flies over the continent every now and then with first-rate aristocratical velocity. But she has one feeling, sometimes shared by more ordinary mortals, which is a prodigious love of music. This, and a sort of besoin, to which she pleads guilty, of holding a salon every evening that she is not from home, forces upon her, as I take it, the necessity of visiting many of us who might elsewhere scarcely be deemed worthy to approach her footstool. We met her at the Parslows, where the girls' performances elicited a very gracious degree of approbation. An introduction followed. She has honoured me by attending a concert in my own house, and this is the 4th evening we have passed with her. Now you have the carte du pays, and I think you will agree with me that it is much better I should make my entrée with you on my arm, than permit you to follow with the damsels in my train." Agnes confessed that she thought the arrangement much more conducive to the dignity of her approach, and thanked her companion for her thoughtful attention. "Perhaps it is not quite disinterested, Agnes. I am rather proud of having such an exotic to produce. What a delightful Aunt Compton it is! Carriage perfect, servants evidently town-made, white satin and blonde fit for an incipient duchess. If your little head be not turned, Agnes, you will deserve to be chronicled as a miracle." "I have had enough to steady the giddiest craft that ever was launched, my dear Mrs. Peters," replied Agnes, "and it would be silly indeed to throw my ballast overboard because I am sailing before the wind." "Then your head is not turned. That is what you mean to say, is it not?" "No," replied Agnes, laughing, "my head is not turned. I feel almost sure of it. But why do you make such particular inquiries respecting the state of my head at present, Mrs. Peters? Shall I be called upon to give some illustrious proof of its healthy condition to-night?" "Yes, my dear, you will assuredly be called upon to sing, and you must prove to my satisfaction that you are not grown too fine to oblige your friends. Is that all? Depend upon it, I will do whatever you wish me." Mrs. Pemberton's drawing-room was full of company when they entered it, but that lady espied them the moment they arrived, and stepped forward with so much eagerness to receive them, that Agnes thought Mrs. Peters had, in her account of the acquaintance between them, hardly done justice to the degree of favour she had risen to. But a few minutes more convinced her that even she, unknown as she was, might flatter herself that some portion of this distinguished reception was intended for her; for Mrs. Pemberton took her hand and led her to a seat at the upper end of the room with an air of such marked distinction as, spite of the philosophy of which she had just been boasting, brought a very bright flush to her cheeks, if it did not turn her head. The few words, however, spoken by that lady to one of those beside whom she placed her, explained the mystery, and proved that Mrs. Peters had deemed it prudent to intimate her intention of bringing a young friend with her beforehand. "Miss Eversham, you must permit me to introduce this young lady to you, Miss Willoughby. Miss Eversham. From a little word in Mrs. Peters' note this morning, I flatter myself that I shall have the gratification of hearing you sing together. This lady's voice is a contralto, Miss Willoughby, and from what I have heard of your performance at Mrs. Peters', before I had the pleasure of being acquainted with her, your voices will be delightful together." This most unexpected address was not calculated to restore the composure of Agnes, and it was not without some effort that she summoned courage enough to answer the numerous questions of Miss Eversham, an elderly young lady too much inured to exhibition to have any mercy upon her, when, as an excuse for withdrawing her attention for a moment from the ceaseless catechism that tormented her, she turned away her eyes to look upon the company, and beheld the profile of Colonel Hubert, as he bent to speak to a lady seated on a sofa near which she stood. This was not an occurrence very likely to restore her composure, but at least it spared her any farther anxiety respecting the effort necessary for receiving the attentions of her neighbour properly, for she altogether forgot her vicinity, and became as completely incapable of hearing her farther questions as of answering them. Had he seen her? Did he know she was at Clifton? Was his aunt, was Lady Stephenson there? How would he address her? Would their intercourse begin from the point at which it had broken off? Or would her altered circumstances, by placing each in a new position, lead to a renewed proposal and an answer? Oh, how different from her former one! These were the questions that now addressed themselves to her, making her utterly incapable of hearing the continued string of musical interrogatories which went on beside her. The short interval during which Colonel Hubert retained his attitude and continued his conversation seemed an age, and expectation was growing sick, and almost merging in despair, when at last the lady turned to answer a question from her neighbour, and Colonel Hubert stood upright and cast his eyes upon the company. Her emotion was too powerful to permit bashfulness to take any part in it. She sought his eye and met it. In a moment all suffering was over, and all anxiety 1,000-fold overpaid, for the look she encountered was all her heart could wish. At the first glance, indeed, he evidently did not know her. It was that of a wandering speculative eye that seemed looking out for occupation, and had she quite understood it aright, she might have perceived that it was arrested by a sort of sudden suspicion that it had found something worth pausing upon. But this lasted not above the 10th part of an instant, and then he darted forward, his fine proud countenance expressive of uncontrollable agitation, and the rapidity with which he approached her was such as to show pretty plainly that he forgot it was a crowded drawing-room he was traversing. By the time he reached her, however, short as the interval was, the glow that had lighted up her face when it first arrested his eye had faded into extreme paleness, and when he spoke to her, she trembled so violently as to be quite unable to articulate. Colonel Hubert perceived her agitation, and felt that it approached in some degree to his own. Had he been 25, this would have probably been all he wished to see. As it was, he felt a dreadful spasm at the heart, as the hateful thought occurred that after what had passed there might be two ways in which it might be interpreted. But it was a passing pang; and longing to present her to his aunt and sister, and at the same time release her from the embarrassing curiosity so conspicuous in the manner of her neighbour, he held the hand she extended to him while he said, "Let me lead you to Lady Elizabeth, Miss Willoughby. Both she and Lady Stephenson are in the next room, and will be delighted to see you." Agnes rose, and though really hardly able to stand, replied with all the voice she had, that she should be greatly obliged if he would lead her to them, taking his offered arm as she spoke. At this moment Sir Edward Stephenson crossed the room with his eyes fixed upon her, and with evident curiosity to find out who it was his stately brother-in-law was escorting so obsequiously. The extreme beauty of Agnes, and the remarkable elegance of her dress and appearance had, in truth, already drawn all eyes upon her, and the whispered enquiries of many had been answered by Mrs. Pemberton, with the information that she was an heiress, and the first amateur singer in England. The foundation of these assertions had reached her by the note of the judicious Mrs. Peters, who, while asking permission to bring a young friend, took the opportunity of hinting the two interesting facts above mentioned, and the effect of their repetition among her guests doubtless added not a little to the interest with which Agnes was looked at. Sir Edward Stephenson was among those who had heard of the heiress-ship and the voice, but the name had not reached him; and while looking at the elegant girl in white satin who leant upon Colonel Hubert's arm, not the slightest resemblance between her and the fair girl in deep mourning that he had once or twice seen at Cheltenham occurred to him. There was a stoppage in the doorway between the two rooms, and it was at this moment Sir Edward said in the ear of the Colonel, " Who is your fair friend? Do you not know her, Sir Edward? It is Miss Willoughby." "What, the girl— the person we saw at— Nonsense, Montague. Who is it?" Colonel Hubert shrugged his shoulders at the incredulity of his brother-in-law, and quietly replying, "I have told you all that I know," took advantage of a movement among the crowd in the doorway, and led his fair companion through it. In the short interval occasioned by this stoppage, Agnes so far recovered her composure as to become very keenly alive to the importance of the next few moments to her happiness. Should Lady Elizabeth look harshly, or Lady Stephenson coldly upon her, of what avail would be all the blessings that fate and affection had showered upon her favoured head? And then it was that for the first time she felt the full extent of all she owed to Miss Compton; for the consciousness that she was no longer a penniless, desolate dependent came to her mind at that moment with a feeling 10,000 times more welcome than any display of her aunt's hoarded wealth had ever brought; and the recollection that, in speaking of her to Mrs. Peters, Miss Compton had almost pompously called her my heiress, and the inheritor of my paternal acres, and some £20,000 besides, which at the time had in some sort been painful for her to listen to, was at that agitating moment recalled with a degree of satisfaction that might have been strangely misinterpreted had those around been aware of it. Some might have traced the feeling to pride, and some to vain self-consequence; but in truth it arose from a deep-seated sense of humility that blessed anything likely to lessen the awful distance she felt between herself and Hubert in the eyes of his relations. But with all the aid she could draw from such considerations, her cheek was colourless, and her eyes full of tears when she found herself standing almost like a culprit before the dignified old lady, whose favour she had once gained in a manner so unhoped for, whom she feared she had deeply offended since, and on whose present feelings towards her hung all her hopes of happiness in life. It was not at the first glance that her timid but inquiring eye could learn her sentence, for the expressive countenance of the old lady underwent more than one change before she spoke. At first it very unequivocally indicated astonishment; then came a smile that as plainly told of admiration, at which moment, by the way, her ladyship became impressed with the firmest conviction that the nose of the Honourable Miss Nivet and that of Miss Willoughby were formed on the same model; and at last, whatever intention of reserve might have possessed her, it all melted away, and she held out both her hands with both aspect and words of very cordial welcome. The heart of Agnes gave a bound as these words reached her, and the look of animated happiness which succeeded to the pale melancholy that sat upon her features when she first approached, touched the old lady so sensibly, that nothing but the presence of the crowd around prevented her throwing her arms around her in a fond embrace. Lady Stephenson was from the first instant all affectionate kindness, and even Sir Edward, who had hitherto never appeared to think it necessary that his lady's singing favourite should occupy much of his attention, now put himself forward to claim her acquaintance, apologizing for not having known her at first by saying, "The change of dress, Miss Willoughby, must be my excuse. You have left off mourning since I saw you last." Agnes smiled and bowed, and appeared not to have been in the least degree affronted. In fact, she was at that moment too happy to be otherwise than pleased with everybody in the world. Meanwhile, Colonel Hubert stood looking at her with love, admiration, and astonishment that fully equalled that of his aunt; but the contemplation did not bring him happiness. Without settling the balance very accurately in his own mind, perhaps, He had hitherto felt conscious that his station and fortune, independent at least if not large, might be set against her youth, that constant stumbling block of his felicity, and her surpassing beauty. But there was something in the change from simplicity of dress that almost approached to homeliness, to the costly elegance of costume that was now before him, which seemed to indicate a position to which his own no longer presented so very favourable a contrast. She no longer appeared to be the Agnes to obtain whom he must make a sacrifice that would prove beyond all doubt the vastness of his love, and he trembled as he beheld her the principal object of attention, and the theme of avowed admiration throughout the room. Lady Elizabeth very unceremoniously made room for her next herself, by desiring a gentleman who occupied the seat beside her, which was on a small sofa filling the recess by the chimney, to leave it. " I beg 1,000 pardons, sir, but I see no other place in the room where we could hope for space to sit thus tete-a-tete together, and did you know how near and dear she was to me, you would, I am sure, excuse me." The gentleman, though not a young one, assured her, with the appearance of much sincerity, that to yield a seat to such a young lady could be considered only as honour and happiness by every man. Having thus established her restored favourite at her side, Lady Elizabeth began to whisper innumerable questions about Miss Compton. " How came it, my dear," said she, " that when opening your heart to Emily and me upon the subject of your unfortunate situation with Mrs. Barnaby, you never referred to the possibility of placing yourself under the protection of Miss Compton?" " Because my aunt Compton, having quarrelled with my aunt Barnaby, had refused to take any further notice of me. Mrs. Barnaby at least led me to believe during the 6 or 7 months I passed with her, that every application on my part to Miss Compton would be vain ; and it was only the dreadful predicament into which Mrs. Barnaby's arrest threw me that gave me the desperate courage which I thought necessary for applying to her. But I have since learned, Lady Elizabeth, that at any time one word from me would have sufficed to make her leave her retirement as she now has done, and remove me from my dreadful situation. But it appears that she is not only a kind aunt, but a wealthy one, my dear child. Excuse the observation, Agnes. Situated as we now are together, you cannot deem it impertinent. But your dress indicates as great and as favourable a change in pecuniary matters as your letter and your happy countenance announces in all others. Miss Compton, I presume, is a woman of fortune?" " Her fortune is larger than I imagined it to be," replied Agnes. " She lived with great economy before she adopted me." " And do you know what her intentions are, Agnes ?" rejoined the persevering old lady. " It is only as the aunt of Colonel Hubert, remember this, my dear, it is only as Colonel Hubert's aunt that I ask the question." Agnes blushed with most happy consciousness as she replied, "The interest you so kindly take in me confers both honour and happiness, and however averse to boast of the kindness bestowed, and promised by my dear aunt, I can have no wish to hide from you, Lady Elizabeth, all she has said to me. She knows the honour that has been done me by Colonel Hubert, and knows, too, that nothing but the fear of your displeasure could have made me hesitate to accept it ; and she says, that should no such displeasure interfere, she would bestow a fortune on me." " Well, my dear, I don't believe that any such displeasure is likely to interfere. When will you introduce us to her?" " To morrow, Lady Elizabeth," Agnes eagerly replied, " if you will give us leave to wait upon you." " Yes, that is right, my dear, quite right. She must call on me first ; and yet I am not quite sure of that either. I rather think the friends of the gentleman should wait upon the friends of the lady ; and so I will call upon her to morrow morning, and remember, when you have introduced us to each other, you may go away. We must talk on business. What is her address?" Agnes gave the address very distinctly, which was repeated in the same manner by Lady Elizabeth, just as Mrs. Pemberton approached to entreat her permission to lead her to the pianoforte. " You are going to sing, my dear child ? Very good. I shall be delighted to hear you. And you must get me a place where I can both look at and listen to her, Mrs. Pemberton," said Lady Elizabeth. Considerably surprised, but much pleased to find that the acquaintance she had condescended to make with Mrs. Peters had led her to having the honour of receiving so intimate a friend and favourite of her most illustrious guest, Mrs. Pemberton rather ostentatiously performed the service required of her, and Agnes once more stood up to sing with Lady Elizabeth's arm chair almost as near to her as on the happy night when she first won the old lady's heart at Cheltenham. But where was Colonel Hubert? He had stood so anxiously watching the first few words that passed between his aunt and Agnes. and when he saw her cavalier dismission of her neighbour, and the cordial style of amity with which she pursued her conversation with the beautiful interloper, he almost forgot his doubts and fears in the happiness of seeing one obstacle so decidedly removed, and prudently denying himself the pleasure of being near them, lest his presence might render the conversation less confidential, he withdrew to the other room, and only appeared again before the eyes of Agnes when he took his place beside her to turn over the pages of her song. For the first few moments Agnes feared that she was too happy to sing. But she tried, and found that her voice was clear, and was determined that it should soon be steady, for she wished, let youthful ladies judge how ardently, to renew the impression which she had made on Colonel Hubert on that never-to-be-forgotten morning when she first dared to fancy he loved her. Nor were her wishes vain. She sang as well, and he felt as strongly as before. Her pleasure as she watched this was perfect, but his was very far from being so. He saw that she was the centre of attraction, and not only, as before, the admired of every eye, and the enchanter of every ear, but also the most distinguished, fashionable, and important young lady present. There was not, however, a shadow of the paltry feeling called jealousy in this. The pang that smote his heart arose from memory and not from imagination. Could he, as he now saw this elegant girl the centre of fashion, and the petted favourite of his own proud aunt, forget the generous devoted passion of the unfortunate Frederick? Could he forget that he had used all the influence which the young man's affection to himself had lent him to make him abandon an attachment so every way calculated to ensure his happiness? Could he forget that Frederick was now living an exile from his country, the victim of unhappy love, while he, his trusted confidant, but most pernicious adviser, remained to profit by the absence he himself had caused, and to drain the cup of happiness which his hand had dashed from the lips of his wretched friend? As long as Mrs. Barnaby continued to hang about her, and in some degree to overshadow her with the disgrace of her vulgar levity, Agnes could not be loved without a sacrifice, and the youth and splendid fortune of Frederick Stephenson, as well as the peculiarly strong feelings of his family on the subject, might have stood as reasons why another, less fettered by circumstances, might have married her, though he could not. But how stood the matter now? Agnes had been snatched from Mrs. Barnaby, and borne completely beyond the sphere of her influence. Stephenson's proud brother seemed to bow before her, while his wife selected her as a chosen friend; and worse, 1,000 times worse than all the rest, he had learnt, while he wandered among the company before the music commenced, that Agnes was the proclaimed heiress of 1,500 a year. This last, however, for his comfort he did not believe; but there was enough without it to make him feel that, should he even be so blessed as to teach her to forget the difference of their age, and make her young heart his own, he must, by becoming her husband, appear to the friend who had trusted him as one of the veriest traitors under heaven. Such thoughts were enough to jar the sweetest harmony, and the evening was altogether productive of more pain than pleasure to the unfortunate Colonel Hubert, who, having staked his happiness on a marriage only to be obtained by the consent of his aunt, was now suffering martyrdom from a plethora of success, and would have gladly changed his condition back to what it had been, regardless of consequences. He had laid his heart at the feet of Agnes by the light of her one tallow candle in Half Moon Street, while her sole protectress lay imprisoned in the Fleet. When the party broke up, Colonel Hubert, leaving his aunt to the care of Sir Edward, escorted Mrs. Peters and the 4 young ladies downstairs, where another shock awaited him on hearing her servant inquire which carriage should be called up first, for before answering, Mrs. Peters turned to Agnes and said, "To which name are your servants accustomed to answer, my dear? Miss Compton told me you would have your own carriage here, but perhaps this might only be another mode of saying you would have hers. Shall they call Miss Compton's carriage, or Miss Willoughby's, Agnes?" "They will answer to either, I believe," replied Agnes carelessly, for she was waiting for Colonel Hubert to finish something he was saying to her. "Call Miss Willoughby's carriage, then," said Mrs. Peters to the servants in waiting; and "Miss Willoughby's carriage, Miss Willoughby's carriage," resounded along the hall and through the street. End of chapter 12. Volume 3, Chapter 13 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. Demonstrating the heavy sorrow which may be produced by a young lady's having a larger fortune than her lover expected. Miss Compton was not long kept waiting for the appearance of her promised visitor on the following morning, for before 12 o'clock Lady Elizabeth Norris arrived. Agnes very punctually obeyed the commands that had been given her, and having properly introduced the two old ladies to each other, left them together, and hastened at length to satisfy the anxious curiosity of her friend Mary, by giving her a full account of all the circumstances that had led to the happy change in her prospects. Her tale was listened to with unbroken attention, and when it was ended Miss Peters exclaimed, "Now then, I forgive you, Agnes, and only now, for not returning the love of that very pleasant person, Frederick Stephenson, for I do believe it is nearly impossible for a young lady to be in love with two gentlemen at once, and I now perceive, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that the superb colonel turned your head from the very first moment that you looked, not upon, but up to him. How very strange it is," she continued, "that I should never have suspected the cause of that remarkable refusal. I imagine my dullness arose from my humility. I was conscious myself that I should quite as soon have taken the liberty of falling in love with the autocrat of all the Russias, as with Colonel Hubert, and it therefore never occurred to me that you could be guilty of such audacity. Nevertheless, I will not deny that he is a husband to be proud of, and so I wish you joy heartily. But do tell me," she added, after a moment's meditation, "how do you mean to manage about Mr. Stephenson? Your first meeting will be rather awkward, will it not?" "I fear so," replied Agnes gravely. "But there is no help for it, and I must get over it as well as I can. Fortunately, none of the family have the slightest idea of any such thing, and I hope they never will." "I hope so too, dear, but it would be very unpleasant, would it not, if, upon hearing what is going on, he were to burst in among you and insist upon shooting Colonel Hubert?" This was said playfully, and without a shadow of serious meaning; but it rendered Agnes extremely uneasy, and it required some skill and perseverance on the part of Miss Peters to remove the effect of what she had said. There were, however, too many pleasant points of discourse among the multitude of subjects before them, for her young spirits to cling long to the only one that seemed capable of giving her pain, and on the whole their long and uninterrupted conference was highly gratifying to them both. While this was going on in Rodney Place, something of the same kind, but without any drawback at all, was proceeding in the Mall, between the two old ladies, the result of which may be given more shortly by relating what passed between Lady Elizabeth and her nephew afterwards, than by following them through the whole of their very interesting but somewhat desultory conversation. Colonel Hubert was awaiting the return of his aunt with much anxiety; an anxiety, by the way, which proceeded wholly from the fear that what she might have to report should prove his Agnes to be a meilleure partie than he wished to find her. This singular species of uneasiness was in no degree lessened by the aspect of the old lady as she entered the drawing room in which he was waiting to receive her. "This is a very singular romance, Montague, as ever I remember to have heard of," she began. "Here is this pretty creature, who was introduced to us as niece and adopted child, as I fancied, of the vulgarest and most atrociously absurd woman in England, without money or wit enough to keep her out of jail, and now she turns out to be a young lady of large fortune, perfectly well educated, and well descended on both sides of her house. And all this, too, without any legerdemain, denouement, or discoveries. I wish you joy heartily, Montague. Her fortune is exactly what was wanted to make yours comfortable. She has 1,500 a year, part of which is, by Miss Compton's account, a very improvable estate in Devonshire. But I suspect the old lady will like to give a name to your second son, or should you have no second son, to a daughter. Nor can I blame her for this. By her account, Compton of Compton Basset has endured long enough in the land to render the wish that it should not pass away a very reasonable one, especially for the person who holds and has to bequeath the estate, to which it has for centuries been annexed. So that point I presume you will not cavil at. You must take care, however, that the liberal-minded old gentlewoman, in making this noble settlement on her niece, does not leave herself too bare. She talked of the trifle that would follow at her death. This ought not to be a trifle, and were I you, Montague, I would insist that the amount settled on Agnes at your marriage should not exceed 1,000 a year. This, with the next step in your profession, will make your income a very sufficient one, even without the regiment which you have such fair reason to hope for." During the whole of this harangue Colonel Hubert was suffering very severely, till by the time her ladyship had concluded, his imagination became so morbidly alive that he almost fancied himself already in the presence of his injured friend. He fancied him hastening home to be a witness at his marriage, and gazing with a cold reproachful eye as the beauty, the wealth, the connections of Agnes were all shown to be exactly what his friends would have approved for him, Had not a false, a base and interested adviser contrived to render vain his generous and honourable love, that he might win the precious prize himself? What a picture was this for such a mind as Hubert's to contemplate! Had not Lady Elizabeth been exceedingly occupied by the curious and unexpected discovery she had made concerning the race and the rents of the Comptons, she must have perceived how greatly the effect of her statement was the reverse of pleasurable to her auditor; but in truth her attention was not fixed upon him, but upon Miss Compton, whom she considered as one of the most remarkable originals she had ever met with, and ceased not to congratulate herself upon the happy chance which had turned her yielding kindness to her nephew into a source of so much interesting speculation to herself. Receiving no answer to the speech she had made, she added very good-humouredly, "That's all, Mr. Benedict. Now you may depart to look for the young lady, and you may tell her, if you please, that upon the whole I very much doubt if the United Kingdoms might not be ransacked through, without finding any one I should more completely approve in all ways as the wife of Montague Hubert. Poor Sir Edward! How he will wish that all his anxieties respecting his hair-brained brother had been brought to a termination by the young man's having had the wit to fall in love with this sweet girl instead of you. But I doubt if Frederick Stephenson has sufficient taste and refinement of mind to appreciate such a girl as Agnes. He probably overlooked her altogether, or perhaps amused himself more by quizzing the absurdities of the aunt, than by paying any particular attention to her delicate and unobtrusive niece. It required such a mind as yours, Montague, to overcome all the apparent obstacles and objections with which she was surrounded. I honour you for it, and so, perhaps, will your giddy-headed friend too, when he comes to know her. She is a gem that we shall all have reason to be proud of." Colonel Hubert could bear no more, but muttering something about wishing immediately to write letters, he hurried out of the room, and shut himself into the parlour which had been appropriated to his morning use. Without giving himself time to think very deliberately of the comparative good and evil that might ensue, he seized a pen, and wrote the following letter to Mr. Stephenson. "Dear Frederick, we parted painfully, and my regard for you is too sincere for me to endure the idea of meeting you again with equal pain. I have had reason since you left England to believe that, notwithstanding the very objectionable manners and conduct of Mrs. Barnaby, her niece Miss Willoughby is in every way worthy of the attachment you conceived for her. Nay, that her family and fortune are such as even your brother and sisters would approve. I will not conceal from you that there are others who have discovered, though not so early as yourself, the attractions and the merits of Miss Willoughby. But who can say, Frederick, that if your early and generous devotion were made known to her, she might not give you the preference over those who were less prompt in surrendering their affections than yourself? If then your feelings towards her continue to be the same as when we parted at our breakfast table at Clifton, and this I cannot doubt, for Agnes is not formed to be loved once and then forgotten. If you still love her, Frederick, hasten home, and take the advantage which your early conceived and unhesitating affection gives you over those who saw her more than once, before they discovered how important she was to their happiness. Notwithstanding the impatience with which you listened to my remonstrances on the subject of a connection with Mrs. Barnaby, I believe that they were in truth the cause of your abandoning a pursuit in which your heart was deeply interested. In so believing, I cannot rest till I have told you that a marriage with Miss Willoughby no longer involves the necessity of any personal intercourse with Mrs. Barnaby. They are separated, and probably for ever. Believe me now and for ever, very faithfully your friend, Montague Hubert." The effort necessary for writing and dispatching this letter by the post was of service to him. It tended to make him feel more reconciled to himself, and less impatient under the infliction of hearing the favoured position of Miss Willoughby descanted upon. But much anxiety, much suffering still remained. How should he again meet Agnes? Despite 1,000 dear suspicions to the contrary, he could not wholly conquer the belief that it was her indifference, or some feeling connected with the disparity of their age, which dictated the too well-remembered words, "I will never be your wife." And his best consolation under the terrible idea that he had recalled a rival to compete with him, arose from the feeling that if, when his own proposals and those of Frederick were both before her, she should bestow herself on him, he might and must believe that, spite of his 35 years, she loved him. But though he hailed such comfort as might be got from this, it could not enable him to see Agnes, while this uncertainty remained, without such a degree of restraint as must convert all intercourse with her into misery. Agnes, meanwhile, was indulging herself with all the happy confidence of youthful friendship, in relating to her friend everything that had happened since they parted, and returned to the Mall soon after Lady Elizabeth had left it, with a heart glowing with love, gratitude, hope, and joy. The narrative with which Miss Compton welcomed her was just all she wished and expected; and when told that the evening was to be passed at the lodgings of Lady Elizabeth Norris, she thanked the delighted old lady for the intelligence with a kiss that spoke her gladness better than any words could have done. The evening came, and found the aunt and niece ready to keep their engagement, with such an equality of happiness expressed in the countenance of each, as might leave it doubtful which enjoyed the prospect of it the most. The pretty dress of Agnes, with all its simplicity, was rather more studied than usual; and it was the consciousness of this, perhaps, which occasioned her to blush so beautifully when Miss Compton made her a laughing compliment about the delicate style of it. " You look like a lily, my Agnes," said the old lady, gazing at her with fond admiration. " You have certainly got very tired of black, my dear child, for I perceive that whenever you wish to look very nice, you select unmixed white for your decoration." " I think it best expresses the change in my condition," replied Agnes. " Oh, my dear aunt, how very, very happy you have made me !" Nothing could be more gratifying than the manner in which they were received by Lady Elizabeth, Lady Stephenson, and Sir Edward. But Colonel Hubert was not in the drawing room when they entered. For a short time, however, his absence was not regretted, even by Agnes, as she was not sorry for the opportunity it gave her of receiving the affectionate congratulations of her future sister, and it was with a feeling likely to produce much lasting love between them, that the one related, and the other listened to, the history of Colonel Hubert's return from London, of his first bold avowal of his love to his aunt, and of the comfort he had found in the reception given this avowal by Lady Stephenson herself. But still Colonel Hubert came not; and at length Lady Elizabeth exclaimed, with a spice of her usual vivacity, " Upon my word, I believe that Montague is writing an account of his felicity to every officer in the British army. He darted out of the room this morning before I had half finished what I had to say to him. He hardly spoke 3 words while dinner lasted, and off he was again as soon as the cloth was removed, and each time something about writing letters was the only intelligible words I got from him. I wish you would go, Sir Edward, and see if he is writing letters now, and I will ring for tea. I mean to make Montague sing to-night with Agnes. Emily has taken care that you should have a good piano, my dear, and you must take care that, while I stay here, I have music enough to make up for the loss of my menagerie, for I don't think I shall begin collecting again just yet." Sir Edward obeyed the old lady's wishes, and when the tea was half over, returned with his brother-in-law. This was the first time that Colonel Hubert had been seen by Miss Compton, and the moment was not a favourable one for removing the idea which she had originally conceived, of his being too old for the lover and husband of her beautiful niece. He was looking pale, harassed, and fatigued; but while Agnes feared only that he might be unwell, her aunt, though she could not deny that he was a gentleman of a most noble presence — it was thus she expressed herself in speaking of him to Mrs. Peters — thought that it was strange so young a girl should have fixed her fancy upon him in preference to all the world beside. In fact, Miss Compton's notions of a lover being drawn solely from the imaginary models she had made acquaintance with among her bees and flowers, she would have been better pleased to see a bright-eyed youth of 21 as the hero of her own romance, than the dignified but melancholy man who now stood before her. Having received his salutation, and returned it with that tone and look of intelligent cheerfulness which redeemed all she said from any imputation of want of polish, or deficiency of high-bred elegance, she turned her eyes on the face of Agnes, and there she read such speaking testimony of love and admiration, that all her romantic wishes for her perfect bliss were satisfied; and following the direction of those speaking eyes, and once more examining the features and person of Hubert, she satisfied herself by the conviction that if not young, he was supremely elegant; and that if his complexion had lost its bloom, his manners had attained a degree of dignity superior, as she thought, to anything described among the young gentlemen whose images were familiar to her imagination. It was slowly that Colonel Hubert approached Agnes, and mournfully that he gazed upon her; but there was to her feelings a pleasure in his presence, which for a long time prevented her being fully conscious that he, on his part, was not so happy as she had hoped it was in her power to make him. By degrees, however, the conviction of this sad truth made its way to her heart, and from that moment her joy and gladness faded, drooped, and died away, like a flower into which a gnawing worm has found its way, and nestled in the very core. This did not happen on this first evening of their meeting under the roof of Lady Elizabeth, for Agnes indulged her with every song she desired to hear. Lady Stephenson sang too, nor could Colonel Hubert refuse to join them, so that to the unsuspicious Agnes that evening seemed delightful. But a silent, melancholy walk on the following morning made her ask herself where was the ardent love for which he had pleaded in Half Moon Street? Had she mistaken him when he said that his happiness depended wholly on her? And if not, what was it had turned him thus to stone? Poor Agnes! She could have no confidant in this new sorrow. Her aunt Compton and her friend Mary had both spoken of him as too old to be a lover, and did she breathe to either a fear that his affection had already grown cold, might they not tell her that it was but natural? Such words, she thought, would break her heart, for every hour he became dearer to her than before, as she saw he was unhappy; and, thinking more of him than of herself, mourned more for his sorrow, of which she knew nothing, than for her own, though it was rapidly undermining her health and destroying her bloom. End of chapter 13. Volume 3, Chapter 14 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14 returns to Mrs. Barnaby, and relates some of the most interesting and instructive scenes of her life, together with several circumstances relative to one dearer to her than herself. The real heroine of this love story has been left too long, and it is necessary we should return to see in what way her generous friendship for Mr. O'Donagough was likely to end. Having kept her promise, and paid the debt for which he had been detained, as well as comforted him by the farther loan of £2 10s. 4d., she stated to him her intention of remaining for a month longer at her lodgings in Half Moon Street, adding, with a degree of naivete that O'Donagough felt to be extremely touching: "Let this be a month of probation, my dear friend, for us both. We met under circumstances too much calculated to soften the heart for either of us, perhaps, to be able fairly to judge how we may feel when those circumstances are past. Let me see as much of you as your occupations will permit. I shall dine at 5 o'clock, because the evenings are drawing in, and I don't love candlelight before dinner. You will always find a steak or a chop, and a little brandy and water, or something of that sort. And now, adieu. This is a disagreeable place to pay or receive visits in, and I flatter myself that I now leave it for ever. Let the most glowing gratitude that heart can feel be set forth in words of fluent eloquence, such as befit the class to which Mr. O'Donagough belonged, and the answer which he gave to this speech will be the product." Nevertheless, Mr. O'Donagough knew what it meant perfectly well. It meant that the widow Barnaby, although she had made up her mind to give herself and whatever she might happen to possess to a husband, and although she was exceedingly well inclined to let that husband be Mr. Patrick O'Donagough, she did not intend to go thus far in manifesting her favour towards him without knowing a little more than she did at present respecting the state of his affairs. In a word, he perceived, as he repeated to himself, with an approving smile, that though on marriage she was bent, she had a prudent mind. Nor was he, notwithstanding the little irregularities into which he had heretofore fallen, unworthy of becoming an object of tender attention to Mrs. Barnaby. Much as he admired her, he had steeled his soul to the virtuous resolution of putting a sudden stop to all farther intercourse between them, should he find upon inquiry that prudence did not justify its continuance. Whatever deficiency of wisdom, therefore, the conduct of either had before shown, it was evident that both were now actuated by a praiseworthy spirit of forethought that ought to have ensured the felicity of their future years. It will be evident to all who study the state of the widow's mind at this period that she had considerably lowered the tone of her hopes and expectations from the moment she became aware of the defection of Lord Mucklebury. The shock which her hopes had received by the disagreeable denouement of her engagement with Major Allen had been perfectly cured, at least for a time, by the devotion of the noble Viscount, and so well satisfied was she herself at an escape which had left her free to aim at a quarry so infinitely higher, that what had been a mortification turned to a triumph, and she enjoyed the idea that when she seemed to slip, she had so gloriously recovered herself as to leave Mrs. Peters and other envious wonderers cause to exclaim, "She rises higher half her length." But from the time this coroneted bubble burst, her courage fell. Her arrest was another blow. Mr. Morrison's desertion one heavier still, and little as she cared for Agnes, or in truth for anybody living but herself, the manner of her departure vexed and humbled her. "That crooked hag," thinks she, "has made me truckle to her," she exclaimed as her aunt and her niece drove off on the night that Agnes first took up her abode with Miss Compton. "She thinks that because she spent some of her beggar's money to hire a carriage in order to bully me, I shall count myself despised and forsaken. But the spiteful old maid shall hear of my being married again, and that will be wormwood, I'll answer for it." It was in this spirit that she set about inquiring into the private character and prospects of young Mr. O'Donagough, and her first step in the business showed at once her judgment and her zeal. In the history he had given of himself, he had spoken of a certain most respectable bookseller, who, as he modestly hinted, knowing his worth, and the exemplary manner in which he had turned from horse racing to preaching, had exerted himself in the kindest manner to obtain some situation for him that should atone for the severity of his father. It was to him he had owed the engagement as domestic chaplain in the family of the nobleman formerly mentioned, and it was to him Mrs. Barnaby addressed herself for information that might lead to an engagement of still greater importance. It was not, however, her purpose that her real object should be known, and she, therefore, framed her inquiries in such a manner as to lead Mr. Newbirth to suppose that her object was to obtain either a teacher or a preacher for her family circle. Having made it known that she wished a few minutes' private conversation with the principal, she was shown into a parlour by one of the clerks, and civilly requested to sit down for a few minutes till Mr. Newbirth could wait upon her. It must be the fault of every individual so placed, if such few minutes have not turned to good account, for the table of this exemplary publisher was covered elbow deep in tracts, sermons, missionary reports, mystical magazines, and the like. But as Mrs. Barnaby was not habitually a reader, she did not profit so much as she might have done by her situation, and before Mr. Newbirth's arrival had begun to think the few minutes mentioned by his clerk were unusually long ones. At length, however, he appeared, and then it was impossible to think she had waited too long for him, for the gentle suavity of his demeanour made even a moment of his presence invaluable. "You have business with me, madam?" he said, with his heels gracefully fixed together, and his person bent forward in humble salutation, as far as was consistent with the safety of his nose. "Pray do not rise. I have now 5 minutes that I can spare without neglecting any serious duty," and so saying, he placed himself opposite to the lady, in act to listen. "I have taken the liberty of waiting upon you, sir," replied Mrs. Barnaby, a little alarmed at the hint that her business must be completed in the space of 5 minutes, "in order to make some inquiries respecting a Mr. O'Donagough, who is, I believe, known to you." "Mr. O'Donagough? The Reverend Mr. O'Donagough, madam?" The widow, though well disposed to enlarge her knowledge and extend the limits of her principles, was not yet fully initiated into the mysteries of regenerated ordinations, and therefore replied, as the daughter of an English clergyman might well be excused for doing, "No, sir, the gentleman I mean is Mr. Patrick O'Donagough. He was not brought up to the church." But there was something in the phrase, "brought up to the church," that grated against the feelings of Mr. Newbirth, and his brow contracted, and his voice became exceedingly solemn as he said, "I know Mr. Patrick O'Donagough, who, like many other shining lights, was not brought up to the church, but has, nevertheless, received the title of Reverend from the congregation which has the best right to bestow it, even that to which he has been called to preach." Mrs. Barnaby was not slow in perceiving her mistake, and proceeded with her inquiries in such a manner as to prove that she was not unworthy to intercommune either with Mr. Newbirth himself, or any of those to whom he extended his patronage. The result of the interview was highly satisfactory; for though it seemed clear that Mr. Newbirth was aware of the vexatious accident which had for some months checked the young preacher's career, it was equally evident that the circumstance made no unfavourable impression, and Mrs. Barnaby returned to her lodgings with a pleasing conviction that now, at least, there could be no danger in giving way to the tender feeling which had so repeatedly beguiled her. The Reverend Mr. O'Donagough would look very well in the paragraph which she was determined should record her marriage in the Exeter paper; and being quite determined that the £327 per annum, which still remained of her income, should be firmly settled on herself, she received her handsome friend, when he arrived at the hour of dinner, in a manner which showed he had lost nothing in her esteem since they parted. It had so happened that within half an hour of the widow's quitting the shop of Mr. Newbirth, Mr. O'Donagough entered it. His patron received him very graciously, and failed not to mention the visit he had received, which, though not elucidated by the lady's leaving any name, was perfectly well understood by the person principally concerned. There are some men who might have felt offended by learning that such a means of improving acquaintance had been resorted to, but its effect on Mr. O'Donagough was exactly the reverse. His respect and estimation for the widow were infinitely increased thereby; for though still a young man, he had considerable experience, and he felt assured that if Mrs. Barnaby had not something to bestow besides her fair fat hand, she would have been less cautious in letting it follow where it was so certain her heart had gone before. The conviction thus logically obtained assisted the progress of the affair very essentially. Having learnt from Mr. Newbirth that the place he had lost by the ill-timed arrest was filled by another who was not likely to give it up again, he once more contrived to make his way to the presence of his father, and gave him very clearly to understand that the very best thing he could do would be once more to furnish the means for his departure from Europe. "That you may spend it again at the gaming table, you audacious scamp," responded his noble but incensed progenitor. "No, no, sir," replied the soft-voiced young preacher. "You are not aware of the change in my principles, or you would have no such injurious suspicion." "As to your principles, Pat," replied his lordship, beguiled into a smile by the sanctified solemnity of his versatile son, "I do not comprehend how you could change them, seeing that you never had any." "Then instead of principles, sir, let me speak of practice. It is now several months since I exchanged the race course, the billiard table, and the dice box, for the course of an extemporary preacher. I am afraid, my lord, that your taste rather leads you to performances of a different kind, or I would ask you to attend the meeting at which I am to expound next Wednesday evening, after which you could hardly doubt, I imagine, the sincerity of my conversation." "It would be putting your eloquence to rather a severe test, Master Patrick. But if you have really got a church to preach in at home, why in the devil's name should you bother me again about going abroad?" "Because, my lord, I have no fixed stipend, or any other honest and safe means of getting my bread, and also because there are many other reasons which make it desirable that I should leave this country." "That at least is likely enough, to be sure, Mr. O'Donagough. But have the kindness to tell me what security you would give me for taking yourself off, if I were again to furnish the means for it." This was exactly the point to which the reformed son wished to bring the yielding father; for it was not difficult to show many reasons for believing that he was in earnest in his intention to depart with as little delay as possible. It was with great caution, however, that he hinted at the possibility of his taking a lady with him as his wife, whose fortune was sufficient to prevent the necessity of his returning again to beg for bread, even at the risk of liberty or life; for he feared that if he confessed the prosperous state of his matrimonial hopes, they might be held sufficient for his necessities. But here he was mistaken; for no sooner did his father discover that his case was not quite desperate, than he manifested a considerable softening, and before a fortnight had expired, Mr. O'Donagough was able to convince the enamoured widow that, in uniting her destiny to his, she would be yielding to no sinful weakness, but securing both her temporal and eternal felicity on the firmest footing possible. And now everything went on in so prosperous a manner as almost to disprove the truth of the oft-quoted assertion of the poet, "The course of true love never did run smooth." For the loves of Mr. O'Donagough and Mrs. Barnaby met with not even a pebble of opposition as they ran evenly on towards matrimony. This peaceful and pleasant progress was not a little assisted by a visit which the prudent peer deemed it advisable to make to the intended bride. Nothing could be more agreeable to the feelings of the lady than this attention, nothing more advantageous to the interests of both parties than the result. His lordship ascertained to a certainty that the widow had wherewithal to feed his son, and most obligingly took care that it should be so secured as to place her fortune beyond the reach of any relapse on his part, while the fair lady herself, amidst all the gentle sweetness with which she seemed to let his lordship manage everything, took excellent care of herself. One thing only remained to be settled before the marriage took place, and this was the obtaining an appointment as missionary to a congregation newly established in a beautiful part of Australia, where there was every reason to suppose that a large and brilliant society would soon give as much éclat to the successful efforts of an eloquent preacher as could be hoped for in the most fashionable réunion of saints in the mother country. The appointment was, in effect, left in the hands of one or two whose constant exertions, and never let anything escape them habits, made them of personal importance in every decision of the kind. This little committee agreed to meet at Mr. Newburth's on a certain evening, for the purpose of being introduced to Mrs. Barnaby, and it was understood among them that if they found reason to be satisfied with her principles, and probable usefulness in a new congregation, the appointment should be given to Mr. O'Donagough, whose approaching marriage with her was well known to them all. Mrs. Newbirth, who was quite a model of a wife, and who therefore shared all her husband's peculiar notions respecting things in heaven and earth, very obligingly lent her assistance at this important session, both to prevent Mrs. Barnaby's feeling herself awkward, as being the only lady present, and because it was reasonably supposed that she might be useful in giving the conversation such a turn as should elicit some of the more hidden, but not, therefore, the least important traits of female character. It was not intended that either Mr. O'Donagough or his intended bride should be aware of the importance attached to this tea-drinking in Mr. Newburth's drawing-room. But the expectant missionary had not lived 30 years in this wicked world for nothing, and though the invitation was given in the most impromptu style possible, he instantly suspected that the leaders of the congregation, who were about to send out the mission, intended to make this an opportunity for discovering what manner of woman the future Mrs. O'Donagough might be. Considerable anxiety was the consequence of this idea in the mind of Mr. O'Donagough. He liked the thoughts of preaching and lecturing to the ladies and gentlemen of Modeltown, and therefore determined to spare no pains in preparing the widow for the trial that awaited her. He found her by no means unapt at receiving the hints he gave respecting several important articles of faith, which, although new to her, she seemed willing enough to adopt without much inquiry, but he had a hard struggle before he could obtain the straightening of a single ringlet, or the paling, in the slightest degree, the tint of her glowing rouge. At length, however, the contest ended by his declaring that, without her compliance on this point, he should feel it his duty, passionately as he adored her, to delay their marriage till she could be induced, for his sake, to conform herself a little more to the customs and manners of the sect to which she belonged. Mrs. Barnaby's heart was not proof against such a remonstrance as this. Her resolution melted into tears, and she promised that if he would never utter such cruel words again, he should dress her hair himself in any manner he would choose. "As to my rouge," she added, "I have only worn it, my dear O'Donagough, because I consider it as the appendage of a woman of fashion, but I will wear much less, that is to say, almost none at all, for the fashion, if such shall be your wish." "Thank you, my dear. That's all right, and I'll never plague you about it after I once get the appointment. Only do what I bid you tonight, and we'll snap our fingers at them afterwards." The party assembled at Mr. Newbirth's consisted of himself and his lady, and 4 gentlemen belonging to the congregation, which was to be propitiated. After the tea and coffee had disappeared, Mr. Newbirth, who was the only gentleman in the company, except her own O'Donagough, with whom Mrs. Barnaby was personally acquainted, opened the conversation by asking if the change of residence which she contemplated from one side of the world to the other was an agreeable prospect to her. "Very much so indeed," was the reply. "I suppose you are aware, ma'am," observed Mr. Littleton, who was senior clerk in a banking house, and the principal lay orator of the congregation, "I suppose you are aware that you are going among a set of people who, though decidedly the most interesting portion of the human race in the eyes of all true Christians, are nevertheless persons accustomed heretofore to habits of irregular, not to say licentious living. How do you think, ma'am, that you shall like to fall into habits of friendship and intimacy with such?" Mr. O'Donagough listened with a good deal of anxiety for the answer, but it was a point on which he had given his affianced bride very ample instructions, and she did not disgrace her teacher. "My notions upon that point, sir," she replied, "are rather particular, I believe; for so far from thinking the worse of my fellow creatures because they have done wrong, I always think that is the very reason why I should seek their company, and exert myself in all ways to do them good, and to make them take their place among the first and greatest in the kingdom of heaven." A murmur of applause ran around the little circle as Mrs. Barnaby concluded her speech, and Mr. Littleton, in particular, expressed his approbation of her sentiments in a manner that inspired the happy O'Donagough with the most sanguine hopes of success. "I never heard better sense or sounder principles or more Christian feelings in the whole course of my life than what this lady has now expressed. And I will take upon me to say, gentlemen, without making any new difficulty about the matter, that any minister going out to Sydney in the holy and reverend character of a missionary, sent by an independent congregation of devotional men, with such a wife in his hand as this good lady will be sure to make, will do more good in his generation than all the bishops and archbishops that ever were consecrated after the manner of the worn-out superstitions of bygone ages. Gentlemen," he continued, rising from his chair, "I do therefore forthwith propose the immediate election of the Reverend Patrick O'Donagough to the office of missionary from the Independent Congregation of Anti-Work Christians of London to the Independent Congregation of Anti-Work Christians at Sydney, with the privilege and undivided monopoly of tract and hymn selling to the said congregation, together with a patent right, not royal patent, but holy patent, to all fees, donations, contributions, and payments of whatsoever kind, made by the said Independent Congregation of Anti-Work Christians at Sydney, for and on account of the salvation of their souls. This, gentlemen, is the resolution I would propose, and I trust that some among you will readily be found to second it." "That, sir, will I, and most joyfully," said Mr. Dellont, rising, "for I neither do nor can feel the shadow of a doubt that our beneficent objects in dispatching this mission will be more forwarded by this appointment than by any other. It is probable — gentlemen, I might say possible — we could make, for where, I would ask, shall we find another Mrs. Barnaby? May we not say, in the language of Scripture, that she is a help meet for him, even for the Reverend Patrick O'Donagough, whom we have chosen?" Mr. Newbirth followed on the same side, giving many unanswerable reasons for believing that nothing which the stiff-necked, unconverted, obsolete ministers of the Church of England could do for the predestined army of saints at present located at Sydney, could approach in utility and saving efficacy of absolving grace, to what might be hoped from the ministry of Mr. O'Donagough, assisted by the lady he was so happy as to have engaged to be his wife. "It gives me the most heartfelt pleasure, gentlemen," he continued, "that my little humble drawing-room should have made the scene of this happy election. How many souls, now most probably grovelling in the lowest depths of vice, will have places secured them upon the highest seats of heaven, by your work, gentlemen, begun, continued, and ended within this one propitious hour. I would now propose that we do all stand up and sing a hymn to the glory of sinners made perfect. Next, that we do all kneel down to hear and join in an awakening prayer from our new missionary. And finally, that we walk into Mrs. Newbirth's back drawing-room, there to partake of such creature comforts as she in her care shall have provided." This speech was also received with great applause. Some few pleasant and holy remarks and observations were made by the other gentlemen present, and all things proceeded to the happy finale suggested by their host, in the most amicable and satisfactory manner, so that before Mr. O'Donagough rose to escort Mrs. Barnaby to the coach which was to convey her to Half Moon Street, he was given to understand, on the indefeasible authority of Mr. Littleton, that he might consider himself already as the anti-work missionary elect, and might set about the preparations for his marriage and subsequent departure without farther uncertainty or delay. Mrs. Barnaby's troubles now seemed really at an end. Nothing could move onward with a smoother, surer pace than did the business which she and her chosen companion had before them. The bridegroom's noble father became liberal and kind under the certainty of his clever son's certain departure. The lawyers behaved exceedingly well about the settlements, influenced perhaps in some degree by the wishes of the peer, who, as it seemed, was almost nervously anxious for the departure of the happy pair. The dressmakers worked briskly, and a very respectable subscription was raised among the ladies of the independent congregation for the purchase of several elegant little presents for the bride, which they thought might prove useful during her voyage. In this happy state we will leave our heroine, in order to see how matters were proceeding at Clifton. End of chapter 14. Volume 3, Chapter 15 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Agnes grows miserable. An explanatory conversation with Colonel Hubert leaves her more in the dark than ever. A letter arrives from Frederick Stephenson. At this period of their history, the star of Agnes appeared much less propitious than that of her aunt Barnaby. Not all her inclination to construe every look and word of Colonel Hubert into something wiser and better, more noble and more kind than the looks and words of any other mortal man, could long prevent her from feeling that he was profoundly unhappy, and that, despite some occasional flashes of an emotion which her own heart taught her to know proceeded from love, he evidently avoided being with her, as much as it was possible for him to do, without attracting the attention of others. Her aunt and his aunt went steadily on arranging between themselves a variety of preliminaries to the happy union they contemplated, while no hint that such a union was possible ever passed the lips of the intended bridegroom during any moment that circumstances placed him near his promised bride. More than once she saw him change colour when he approached her, and sometimes, but not often, she had caught his melancholy eyes fixed earnestly upon her, and it was at such moments that she felt persuaded he still loved her. But wherefore he, who had boldly wooed her when so many things conspired to make his doing it objectionable, should seem to shun her now that everything was so smooth and easy for him, she vainly laboured to understand. "For time nor place," she exclaimed with something like bitterness, "did then adhere, and yet he would make both. They have made themselves, and that their fitness now doth unmake him." By melancholy degrees, everything that had most contributed to her happiness became her torment. The conversation of Miss Peters was inexpressibly irksome to her, particularly when they found themselves in confidential tete-a-tete, for then she could not help suspecting that her friend was longing to ask her some questions respecting the singularity of her lover's manner. The flattering notice of the well-pleased Lady Elizabeth, the sisterly affection manifested by the amiable Lady Stephenson, and, more than all the rest, the happy, bustling, business-like manner of her Aunt Compton, who never for a moment seemed to forget that they were all preparing for a wedding. So complete was this preoccupation, that it was many days before the old lady perceived that her Agnes, in the midst of all this joyful preparation, looked neither well nor happy. Nay, even when at last the sad eye and pale cheek of her darling attracted her attention, she persuaded herself for many days more that love-making was too sentimental a process to permit those engaged in it to be gay. She knew that the sighing of lovers was proverbial, and though she did not remember to have read anything upon the subject exactly resembling what she remarked in Agnes, and to say truth, in Colonel Hubert also, she did not, for she could not, doubt that everything was going on just as it should do, though her own want of practical experience rendered her incapable of fully understanding it. But if Agnes was wretched, Colonel Hubert was infinitely more so. For all the misery that she darkly feared, without knowing either its nature or for how long it was likely to continue, came to him with the tremendous certainty of a misfortune that had already fallen upon him, and from which escape seemed less possible from day to day. She knew not what to think of him, and great, no doubt, was the unhappiness produced by such uncertainty, but greater still was the suffering produced by looking in her innocent face, and knowing, as well as Colonel Hubert did, why it grew daily paler. Not seldom, indeed, was he tortured by the apprehension that the line of conduct he had pursued in recalling Frederick Stephenson was by no means so unquestionably right in its self-sacrificing severity as he had intended it should be. Had he not endangered the tranquillity of Agnes, while guarding with jealous care his own proud sense of honour? If an unhappy concurrence of circumstances had involved him in difficulties that rendered his conduct liable to suspicion, ought he not to have endured the worst degree of contempt that this could bring upon him, rather than have suffered her peace to be the sacrifice? Night and day these doubts tormented him. For hours he wandered through the roads on the opposite side of the river, where, comparatively speaking, he was sure no Clifton idlers could encounter him, and reviewing his own conduct in 1,000 ways, found none that would make him satisfied with himself. At length, in the mere restlessness of misery, he determined to tell Agnes all. She shall know his love, his generous, uncalculating love, while I stood by, and reasoned on the inconvenience her aunt Barnaby's vulgarity might bring. She shall know all, though it will make her hate me. Such was the resolution with which he crossed the ferry after wandering a whole morning in Leigh Wood, and climbing the step-path too rapidly to give himself leisure to meditate temperately on the measure he had determined to pursue, he hurried forward to the dwelling of Miss Compton, and was already in her drawing-room before he had at all decided in what manner he should contrive to get Agnes alone. In this, however, fortune favoured him; for Miss Compton, having some point on which she desired to communicate with Lady Elizabeth, had ordered the carriage, and invited Agnes to pay a visit to Lady Stephenson. But the poor girl had no heart to sustain a conversation with a friend from whom she most earnestly desired to conceal all her thoughts. so she declined the invitation, alleging her wish to write a letter to Empton. As much alone, and, if possible, more melancholy still, than when, a few short weeks before, he made his memorable visit in Half Moon Street, Colonel Hubert found Agnes listlessly lying upon a sofa, her eyes closed, but their lashes too recently wetted by tears to make him fancy her asleep. She was in an inner room, to which he entered through the open door that led from the larger drawing-room, and he was close beside her before she was aware of his approach. It was with a dreadful pang that he contemplated the change anxiety had wrought on her delicate features since the evening she first appeared to him in all the bright light-hearted joy of her new happiness under the protection of her aunt. Love, honour, gratitude, tenderness, and remorse all rushed to his bosom, and so completely overpowered the philosophy by which he had hitherto restrained his feelings, that he dropped on his knees beside her, and, seizing the hand that languidly hung by her side, covered it with passionate kisses. An iron chain is not a stronger restraint than timid delicacy to such a nature as that of Agnes, and therefore she did not throw herself on the bosom of Colonel Hubert, and thus obliterate by one moment of unrestrained feeling all the doubts and fears that had so long tormented them both. She only opened her beautiful eyes upon him, which seemed to say, "Is then the dark cloud past that has divided us? Hubert, may I be happy again?" The unhappy Hubert, however, dared not answer this appeal, though he read it, and felt it at the very bottom of his heart; and what under happier circumstances would have tempted him to kneel beside her for ever, now made him spring to his feet as if terrified at the danger that he ran. "Agnes," he said, "you must no longer be left ignorant of my misery. You must have seen something of it, but not all. You have not seen, you have not guessed what, the struggle has been between a passion as fervent as ever warmed the heart of man and a sense of honour. Too late awakened, perhaps, which has made it a duty to suspend all pleadings for an avowed return, till, repeated Agnes, agitated but full of hope, that the moment was indeed come when the dark and mysterious cloud which had dimmed all her prospects should be dispelled. Hear my confession, Agnes, and pity me at least, if you find it impossible to excuse me. Do you remember the first time I ever saw you? It was at a shop at Clifton." Agnes bowed. "Do you remember the friend who was with me?" Agnes bowed again, and this time she coloured too. Colonel Hubert sighed profoundly, but presently went on with the confession he had braced his nerves to make. "That friend, Agnes, the generous, noble-hearted Frederick Stephenson, saw, even in that brief interview, the beauty, the grace, the delicacy which it took me days to develop. In short, he loved you, Agnes, almost before I had ever looked at you. I was his dearest friend. He hid no thought from me, and with all the frankness of his delightful character he confessed his honourable attachment. And how was it, think you, that I answered him?" Agnes raised her eyes to his face with a very anxious look, but spoke not a word, and Colonel Hubert, with a heightened colour that mounted to his temples, went on. "I told him, Miss Willoughby, that a young lady chaperoned by a person with the manners and appearance of your aunt Barnaby was not a fitting wife for him." The eyes of Agnes fell, and her cheeks too were now dyed with crimson. Colonel Hubert saw it and felt it all, but he went on. "The subject was repeatedly revived between us, and as his attachment increased, so did also my opposition to it. I placed before him, in the strongest manner I was capable of doing, all the objections to the connection as they then appeared to me, and I did it, as I thought, purely from a sense of duty to himself and his family, which had recently become so closely connected with my own. But alas, Agnes, my peace has been and is destroyed by the dreadful doubt whether some selfish feelings, unknown to myself, might not at length have mingled with these strong remonstrances. Knowing as I do the character of Sir Edward and his two sisters, no remorse was awakened in my mind so long as he remained with Mrs. Barnaby, and the last time I conversed with my poor friend, I used language so strong upon the subject that he left me in great anger. But it appears that, notwithstanding his just resentment, these remonstrances had weight, for he immediately left the kingdom, and has, I believe, remained in Paris ever since. Think then, Miss Willoughby, judge for me if you can, with what feelings I contemplate the unlooked-for change in your position. Oh, Agnes, would that your excellent Miss Compton had preserved her coldness to you till you had been my wife. Even then I might have felt a pang for Stephenson, But the knowledge that his friends would not, like mine, have forgotten Mrs. Barnaby in their admiration for her niece, would have furnished a justification of the events which followed his departure too reasonable to be set aside. But what must I feel now, when I think of the banished Frederick? Banished by me, that I might take his place. Excepting to Mary Peters, who had been aware of the attachment of Frederick Stephenson long before herself, Agnes had never breathed a hint to any human being of the proposal she had received from him, and it had not most assuredly been her intention ever to have named it to Colonel Hubert. She had indeed but rarely remembered it herself, and hoped and believed that before they met again the gay young man would quite have forgotten it. But now she could preserve his secret no longer, and eager to speak what she thought would entirely relieve his self-reproaches to hear, she said, with glowing cheeks and an averted eye, "Let me then confess to you, Colonel Hubert." These unlucky words, however, intended as a preface to the only intelligence that could effectively have soothed his agitation, unfortunately increased it tenfold, and raising his hand to arrest what she was about to say, he replied with an impetuosity with which she could not at that moment contend. "Confess nothing, Miss Willoughby, to me. I see that I have awakened feelings which I ought to have foreseen would inevitably be called into existence by such a disclosure. Suffer me to say a few words more, and I have done. A week ago I did what I ought to have done as soon as your present position was known to me. I wrote to Mr. Stephenson, and told him that every obstacle was removed, and that—" "You wrote to him, Colonel Hubert?" exclaimed Agnes, greatly disturbed. "Oh, why did you not tell me all this before?" "It is not yet too late, Miss Willoughby," he replied bitterly. "Another letter shall follow my first, more explicit, more strongly urging his return." "But you will not hear me, Colonel Hubert," said Agnes, bursting into tears. "Have patience for a moment, and you will understand it all." At this moment a carriage stopped at the door, and the knocker and the bell together gave notice of Miss Compton's return. "It is my aunt," cried Agnes. "Indeed she must not see me thus, for how could I explain to her what must appear so strange as her finding me in tears, and you beside me? Let me see you again, Colonel Hubert. I pray you to let me see you again when I may be able to speak to you, but now I must go." And so saying, she escaped from the room just in time to avoid meeting Miss Compton at the door. From a very early period of their short acquaintance, Miss Compton had made up her mind to consider Colonel Hubert as a very superior personage, but of a remarkably grave and silent character; so much so, indeed, that while she admired and approved her Agnes the more for loving and being loved by so dignified an individual, she could not help wondering a little occasionally that so it should be. But this feeling she carefully concealed, and made it a point, whenever a shade of gravity more profound than usual was perceptible on his features, a circumstance not unfrequent, to avoid interfering with his reserve by any loquacious civility. This line of conduct had often been a great relief to him, but never more so than on the present occasion, when if any lengthened greetings had occurred to stop his retreat, it would have been impossible for him to have preserved the outward semblance of cold composure in which he had hitherto found shelter from observation. "You are going, Colonel Hubert," she said. "Well, I will not detain you, for I am going to be busy myself. Good morning." And so he escaped. On reaching home, he found a letter waiting for him, which by no means tended to calm his spirits. It was from Frederick Stephenson, and ran thus: "My dear Hubert, your letter puzzles me, but not many hours after this reaches you, I hope we shall mutually understand each other better than we do at present. I am on my road to England, and as all explanation must be impossible till we meet, I will only add, that I am yours ever, Frederick Stephenson." A few hours then, and all doubt, all uncertainty would be over. A full explanation must take place, and rather than endure a continuance of what he had lately suffered, Colonel Hubert felt inclined to welcome the result, be it what it might. End of chapter 15. Volume 3, Chapter 16 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. A discovery scene, productive of many new relations and various other consequences. The day next but one after this letter reached him, Miss Compton and Agnes were engaged to dine with Lady Elizabeth. Colonel Hubert had not ventured to present himself in the Mall during the interval, for though, on cooler meditation, he did not believe that the unfortunate words, "Let me then confess to you, Colonel Hubert," were meant to usher a confession of love to his rival, he doubted not that they would have been followed by an avowal of her agreeing with himself in deeming his own conduct most reprehensible; and just then he felt he could not receive this, notwithstanding its justice, in such a manner as to assist in obtaining pardon for the fault. To Sir Edward he had mentioned the probability of his brother's early return, but without hinting at the chance of their seeing him at Clifton on his arrival in England. The ladies of the party, namely Lady Elizabeth, Lady Stephenson, Miss Compton, and Agnes, were assembled in the drawing room, the two gentlemen not having yet quitted the dining parlour, when a knock at the door announced company. "Who can that be?" said Lady Stephenson. "Have you invited evening company?" "Not a soul, my dear," replied her aunt. "I mean to have a treat again. I think I am growing sick of curiosities." "Tant mieux, dear aunt," replied Lady Stephenson. "But invited or not, you have visitors coming now. I hear them on the stairs." Lady Stephenson was right. The old butler opened the drawing-room door almost as she spoke, and announced, "Mr. Stephenson." "Frederick!" exclaimed his fair sister-in-law, looking as if she meant to receive him very kindly. "Young Stephenson?" said Lady Elizabeth. "I did not know that he was coming to Clifton." "Sir Edward's brother, I suppose," said Miss Compton. But Agnes said nothing, though had any one laid a hand upon her heart, they would have discovered that his arrival was not a matter of indifference. To receive him with the appearance of it was, however, absolutely necessary, and she very resolutely assumed an aspect of tranquillity. It was not necessary that she should look towards the door to greet him as he entered, and therefore she did not do it; but, notwithstanding the attention she devoted to the pattern of the hearth rug, she became aware, within a moment after this electrifying name had been announced, that not one only, but three people were in the room, and that one of them was a lady. Agnes then looked up, and the first figure which distinctly met her eye was not that of Frederick Stephenson, but of a gentleman bearing the stamp of some 40 years, perhaps, upon his handsome but delicate features. He was not tall, but slightly and elegantly formed, which was perceptible though wrapped in a travelling frock trimmed with fur, and his whole appearance was decidedly that of a gentleman. But who these might be who were with him, or how they were received by Lady Elizabeth, the eye of Agnes had no power to inquire, for it was fascinated, as it were, by the earnest gaze of this stranger, who, having already stepped forward a pace or two nearer to her than the rest, stood looking at her with very evident emotion. The first words she heard spoken were in the voice of young Stephenson, which she immediately recognised, though the purport of them was unintelligible. "Yes, my dear sir, you are quite right," he said, "that is our Agnes." But though these words were somewhat startling, they drew her attention less than the expression of the large blue eyes that were fixed upon her. There was admiration, tenderness, and a strange sort of embarrassment all legibly mingled in that earnest look. But why was it fixed on her? What effect this mute scene produced on the other persons present Agnes could not know, for she did not withdraw her eyes from those of the mysterious stranger, till at length he turned from her, and stepping back, took the hand of a very young but very beautiful girl, whom he led towards the sofa she occupied, and placing her on it, said, "Agnes Willoughby, receive your sister, and let her plead for her father and yours. You have been long, long neglected, my poor child, but there has been some excuse for it. Can you forgive me, Agnes?" "Good God! My father!" she exclaimed, starting up and stretching out her hands towards him. "Is it possible, sir, that you are indeed my father?" "You speak as if you wished it were so, Agnes," he replied, taking her in his arms and impressing a kiss upon her forehead. "And I will echo your words. Is it possible?" "Possible? Oh yes, sir, it is possible. I have so longed to know that I had a father. And is this sweet creature my sister?" she continued, turning her tearful eyes upon the beautiful girl, who upon this appeal sprang forward, and enclosing both her father and Agnes in her arms, replied to it by saying, "Yes, dearest Agnes, I am your sister, indeed I am, and I know you very well, and all about you, though you know so little about me. But you will not refuse to own me, will you?" For all reply Agnes bent forward and kissed her fondly. Miss Compton, who, as may be supposed, had watched this discovery scene with no little interest, now stepped towards them, while young Stephenson was engaged in explaining it to Lady Elizabeth and his sister-in-law. and looking from one sister to the other, and from them both to their father, she said, " You will perhaps hardly remember that we ever met, Mr. Willoughby, but my name is Compton, and I recall your features perfectly. You once passed an hour at my brother's house when I was there, and that these girls are sisters, no one that sees them together will be likely to deny. God bless them both, pretty creatures. I hope they will each be a blessing to the other. But to be sure, it seems to be a most romantic story, and wonderfully like those I used to read in my bower, Agnes." " There is a good deal that is very sad in my part of it, Miss Compton," replied Mr. Willoughby, " but at this moment I can hardly regret it, as herein I hope to show some excuse for my long negligence respecting my poor girl. Take this on trust, my good lady, will you," he added, holding out his hand to her, " that no displeasure towards me may destroy the happiness of this meeting." Miss Compton gave him her hand very frankly, saying, " I have no right to be very severe upon you, Mr. Willoughby, for, without any misfortunes at all to plead as an excuse for it, our dear Agnes might tell you some naughty stories about me. But she does not look as if she were much inclined to complain of anybody. What a pair of happy, lovely looking creatures ! And how very strong the likeness to each other, and of both to you." Willoughby retired a step or two, and leaning against the chimney piece, seemed disposed to enjoy the contemplation of the picture she pointed out, in silence. Lady Elizabeth claimed the attention of Miss Compton, that she might express her interest, satisfaction, surprise, and so forth. Lady Stephenson slipped out of the room to communicate the news to her husband and brother, and prepare them for the company they had to receive; and then Frederick Stephenson approached the sisters, and drawing a chair towards them, very freely took a hand of each. That of Agnes trembled. She felt that the happiness of her life would be for ever destroyed if this young man was come back in consequence of Colonel Hubert's letter, with the persuasion that it was her purpose to accept him; and favourable as was the moment for a sort of universal philanthropy and unrestrained épanchement de coeur, she could not resist the impulse which led her to withdraw her hand, and return his affectionate smile with a look of coldness and reserve. Perfectly undaunted, however, the gay Frederick continued to look at her with an air of the most happy confidence; but suddenly, as it seemed, recollecting that it was possible, though they had all of them been at least 10 minutes in the room together, no explanation might have yet reached her, he said in a manner to show that he was too happy to be very grave, though quite sufficiently in earnest to deserve belief, " If you accept my Nora for a sister, Agnes, you must accept me for a brother too. She knows that till I saw her I thought you the most charming person in the world, and as she forgives me for this, I hope you will show as much resemblance to her in mind as in person, and forgive me for thinking, when I did see her, that she was still more charming than you." And then it was that Agnes, for the first time in her life, felt wholly, perfectly, and altogether happy. She saw in an instant, with the rapid glance of love, that all the misty cloud that had hung between her and Hubert was withdrawn for ever; and then she felt how very delightful it was to have a father, and such an elegant, interesting looking father; and then she became fully aware what a blessing it was to have a sister, and that sister so beautiful, and so capable of inspiring love in every heart, save one, guarded as Hubert's was guarded. Her joy, her new-born gladness of spirit danced in her eyes, as she now freely returned the young man's laughing glance, and restoring to him the hand she had withdrawn, she exclaimed, " Oh, Frederick! Why did you not answer Hubert's letter and tell him this?" " It is so, then ? It is as I hoped, my sweet Agnes ; and you will be doubly our sister. Why did I not answer Hubert's letter? Because it was the most mystical, unintelligible, dark, and diplomatic performance that ever was put forth. Did you see it, Agnes?" " No, I did not," she replied with a smile ;" but I can imagine that it might have been a little in that style. Yet still you should have answered it." " I did answer it ; that is, I replied to it by a line or two written in a prodigious hurry. But you must perceive that I could not enclose Nora in a cover ; and as she is, to all intents and purposes, my answer, I was obliged to let him wait till I could convey her properly, and place her before his eyes and his understanding." " And so convince him," replied Agnes with another smile, full of her new-born gaiety, " that the moment she is seen all other ladies must be forgotten. Prove that to Colonel Hubert, Mr. Stephenson, and I will prove to you—" " What, you tremendous looking sibyl, what?" " A very fatal sister," she replied. And then the door opened, and Lady Stephenson preceded the two gentlemen she had brought from the dining parlour into the room. Agnes, no longer the fearful, shrinking Agnes, sprang forward to meet them, and taking Colonel Hubert by the hand, led him to her father, saying in an altered accent that at once entered his heart and told him that all was right. " Let me present you to my father, Hubert, to my dear father, Colonel Hubert. He will indeed be doubly dear to us, for he has brought with him a sister for both of us, whom I feel sure we shall for ever love." But hardly did Agnes, who seemed newly awakened from some heavy spell that had benumbed her heart, hardly did she give time for a courteous greeting between the gentlemen, ere she passed her arm beneath that of Colonel Hubert, and led him to the sofa. Frederick started forward to meet him, and laying a hand on each shoulder, said in his ear, yet not so low but that Agnes could hear him too, "It was lucky I did not take you to France with me, Hubert, or I should certainly never have got a wife at all. As it is, however, permit me," he added aloud, "to present you, Colonel Hubert, to Miss Nora Willoughby. Nora, dearest, this gentleman is the best friend I have in the world. My brother's wife is his sister, and your sister, my fair bride-elect, will very soon be his wife, or I cannot read the stars. So, as you may perceive, our catastrophe is exceedingly like that great model of all catastrophes, in which the happy hero says, 'And these are all my near relations. Ecce signum, here is my own elder brother. Sir Edward Stephenson, Miss Nora Willoughby. Is she not charming, Edward? I hope I have pleased you at last, and their ladyships my sisters too, for I assure you everything is very elegant, well born, and so forth. But you are not to sit down by her, though, for all that, unless you make room for me between you, for she has already given way more smiles than I can at all afford to spare, and besides, I have 100 things to say to her. I want to ask her how she likes you all." Colonel Hubert, as soon as his gay friend had reseated himself, gave one speaking look to Agnes, and then devoted himself entirely to Mr. Willoughby. By degrees the party began to talk together with less of agitation and more of comfort ; but Frederick was not permitted wholly to engross his young fiancée, for all the ladies crowded round her, and vied with each other in giving a cordial welcome to this young foreigner in the land of her fathers. She was in truth a very sweet young creature, and soon converted the kindness which circumstances called for into very cordially liking. Distant hopes were talked of without reserve, and immediate arrangements canvassed. Miss Compton kindly invited the young stranger to share her sister's apartment, a servant was dispatched to secure rooms for Mr. Willoughby and Frederick at the hotel, and the happiness their unexpected arrival had brought to two harassed hearts of the party seemed to diffuse itself very delightfully among them all. At length Miss Compton's carriage was announced, and while the cloaks of the fair sisters were wrapped round them by their vowed servants, Mr. Willoughby performed the same office for her, and took that opportunity of asking leave to wait upon her on the following morning, in order to relate to her such passages of the history of his long exile as might, in some degree, account for his having left her adopted child for so many years without a father. While this appointment was making with the aunt, the niece contrived, unheard by all, to whisper a word or two which led to an appointment for her also. Colonel Hubert had more than once that evening taught her to understand, by the eloquence of looks, the delightful change that had been wrought within him; but it was Agnes who first found the opportunity of giving expression to it in words. He stood behind her as he arranged her cloak, and when this was done, she turned suddenly round to him and said, in an accent of playful reproach, "Hubert, may I be happy now?" His answer was, "Will you see me to-morrow, and alone?" She blushed, perhaps at remembering how often she had before wished to converse with him in the manner he now for the first time proposed, but she nodded her assent. He handed her to the carriage, pressed her hand, and whispered 11 o'clock, as he put her into it, and then mounted to his chamber without exchanging a word more with any living soul, that he might enjoy, for the first time since he had yielded up his heart, the luxury of meditating on Agnes and her promised love, without any mixture of self-reproach to poison the enjoyment. End of chapter 16. Volume 3, Chapter 17 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Great Contentment. Had not Nora Willoughby been an interesting and amiable creature, her introduction at this moment to all the freedom of a sister's rights would certainly have been less agreeable than surprising to Agnes. And perhaps notwithstanding the sweet expression of her lovely face, the pretty tenderness of her manner, and the lively interest which one so near in blood could not fail to awaken, Agnes, as she entered her bedroom on that eventful night, would rather have entered it alone. Her heart seemed too full to permit her conversing freely with anyone, and it was by an effort, not made altogether without pain, that she turned her thoughts from Hubert and all that vast world of happiness which appeared opening before them, to welcome her fair sister to her bower, and to begin such a conversation with her as sisters so placed might be expected to hold. But she was soon rewarded for the exertion, for it was quite impossible to pass an hour of intimate intercourse with Nora without loving her, for she was made up of frankness, warm affection, lightheartedness, and sweet temper. As soon as Peggy had performed all the services required of her, and that the door was fairly closed behind her, Nora threw her arms round the neck of Agnes, and pressed her in a long and fond embrace. "Dear, dear Agnes," she exclaimed, "I wish you could share the pleasure that I enjoy at this moment, but it is impossible. I came upon you so suddenly, unexpectedly, unintelligibly, and must rather startle and astound than give you the delight that you give me. For I have been preparing to love you for many weeks past, and I have been longing till I was almost sick to get to you. And after such eager and sanguine expectations as mine, it is so delightful to find oneself not disappointed." "And is such the case with my sweet sister?" replied Agnes caressingly. "Indeed, indeed it is. Frederick told me you were very beautiful, but I did not expect to find you half so. So elegant, so finished, so every way superior." "I shall quarrel with you, Nora, if you say such very fine things to me. Perhaps I think you very pretty too, dear. But if I do, I must not say so, because they tell us that we are so much alike, it would be like admiring myself." "Well, and you cannot help admiring yourself, it is impossible. But, sister Agnes, what a blessing it was that you did not happen to fall in love with Frederick. What would have become of me if you had? For, do you know, I loved almost as soon as I saw him. It was all so odd. It was at the Italian opera that we first met, and I could not help observing that the handsomest man I had ever seen was looking at me almost incessantly. Papa never saw a bit about it, for when he is listening to music he never cares for anything. However, I do assure you, I tried to behave properly, though, if I had done quite the contrary, Papa would never have found it out. I never looked at him at all above 3 or 4 times, and that was accidentally from happening to turn around my head. But whether I thought about it or not, there were his beautiful large eyes always sure to be fixed upon me. And when the opera was over, he must have run out of his box the moment we left ours, for I saw him as we got into the fiacre standing close beside it. Well, I hardly know how it happened, but from that time I never stirred out without meeting him. He never spoke, of course, but that did not prevent our knowing one another just as well as if we had been the oldest acquaintance. At last, however, he managed very cleverly to find out that papa was acquainted with Monsieur Dupont, who gives such beautiful concerts, and receives all the English so hospitably, and he asked as a great favour to be invited to meet us. And so he was, and then we were introduced, and then everything went on beautifully, for he knew you and the name of Willoughby, and the likeness and all that, convinced him that we must be the same family. So he and papa very soon made it all out, and then he came to call upon us every day. And very, very soon afterwards I was engaged to be his wife as soon as possible, after we all got back to England." "Thank you, dearest Nora," replied Agnes, who, notwithstanding all her preoccupation, had found no difficulty in listening very attentively to this narrative. "I cannot tell you all the pleasure your little history has given me. There is nobody in the world I should like so well for a brother as Frederick Stephenson, and there is nobody in the world I should like so well for a sister as Frederick Stephenson's wife." "That is delightful," cried Nora joyfully, "and we certainly are 2 of the luckiest girls in the world to have everything just as we would wish. But, Agnes, there is one thing I shall never understand. How could you help falling in love with Frederick when he fell in love with you?" "Because I happened just then," replied Agnes, laughing, "to be falling in love with someone else." "Well, certainly that was the most fortunate thing in the world, and Frederick himself thinks so now. He told me that he had a great mind to shoot himself when you refused him, but that the very first moment he saw me, he felt certain that I should suit him a great deal better than you would have done." "That I am sure is quite true, Nora," replied Agnes, very earnestly, "for I too feel certain that I never could have suited anybody but Colonel Hubert." And now, my sweet sister, let us go to sleep, or we shall hardly be up early enough to meet the friends who, I think, will be wishing to see us again. Good night, dearest." "Good night, darling Agnes. Is not it pleasant to have a sister, Agnes? It is so nice to be able to tell you everything. I am sure I could never be able to do it to anybody else. Good night." "Bless you, sweet Nora," replied Agnes. And then, each nestling upon her pillow, and giving some few happy dreamy thoughts to the object they loved best, they closed their fair young eyes and slept till morning. The waking was to both of them, perhaps, somewhat like the continuance of a dream; but Peggy came in and threw the light of day upon them, while each fair girl seemed to look at her own picture as she contemplated her pretty bedfellow, and appeared to be exceedingly well pleased by the survey. It was already late, and Agnes, rapidly as she was learning to love her companion, did not linger at her toilette, but leaving Nora with a hasty kiss to the care of Peggy, she hastened to the breakfast table, and made Aunt Betsy's heart glad by telling her at last that she expected Colonel Hubert would call about 11 o'clock, and that if she did not think it wrong, she should like to speak to him for a few minutes alone. "Wrong, my child!" exclaimed Miss Compton. "Why, I never in my life read a work painting the manners of the age in which I did not find interviews, sometimes occurring 3 or 4 times in a day, entirely tete-a-tete between the parties." "Then I may go into the back drawing room presently, may I, Aunt Betsy? And perhaps you would tell William." "Yes, yes, my dear, I'll tell him everything. But eat some breakfast, Agnes, or I am sure you will not be able to talk. I suppose it is about your new sister, and your father, and all that you want to speak to him." "There are many things, Aunt Betsy. But, good heavens, there is a knock. Will it not look very odd for you to send him in to me?" Without waiting to give an answer, the agile old lady intercepted William's approach to the door in time to give the order she wished, and in 2 minutes Colonel Hubert was ushered into a room where the happy but blushing Agnes was alone. His first few steps towards her were made at the pace at which drawing-room floors are usually traversed, but the last part of the distance was cleared by a movement considerably more rapid, for she had risen in nervous agitation as he approached, and for the first time that he had ever ventured a caress, he threw his arms round her, and pressed her to his heart. Agnes struggled not to disengage herself, but wept without restraint upon his bosom. "You do then love me, Agnes? At last our hearts have met, and never can be severed more. But still you must tell me very often that you have forgiven me, dearest, for is it not difficult to believe? And does it not require frequent vouching?" "What is it, Montague, that you would have forgiven?" said Agnes, looking up at him, smiling through her tears. This was the first time that her lips had pronounced his Christian name to any ears but her own, and she blushed as she uttered it. "Agnes, my own Agnes," he exclaimed, "you have forgiven me, or you would not call me Montague. How is it possible," he continued, looking fondly at her, "that a word so hackneyed and familiar from infancy as our own name can be made to thrill through the whole frame like a touch of electricity?" He drew her to the sofa from which she had risen, and placing himself by her, said, "Now then, Agnes, let us sit down soberly together, and take an unvarnished retrospect of all that has passed since we first met. Yet why should I ask for this? I hate to think of it, for it is a fact, Agnes, which his subsequent attachment to your sister must not make you doubt. Frederick and his 7,000 a year would have been at your disposal, had not my dissuasions prevented it. And had this been so, who knows?" A shade of melancholy seemed once again settling on the noble countenance of Colonel Hubert. Agnes could not bear it, and looking earnestly at him, she said, "Montague, answer me sincerely this one question, which is the strongest feeling in your mind at this moment: the pleasure derived from believing that your influence on Frederick was so great, or the pain of doubting how the offer you speak of would have been received?" "I have no pleasure in believing I have influence on any one save yourself," he answered gravely. "I am glad of that, Montague," she said, "because you somewhat overrated your influence with my brother-elect. Save for your foolish doubts, infidel, you never should have known it, but Frederick Stephenson did propose to me, Hubert, before he went abroad." "And you refused him, Agnes?" "And I refused him, Hubert." "Oh, had I known this earlier, what misery should I have been spared!" cried Colonel Hubert. "You know not, you could not know all I have suffered, Agnes. Yet surely, dearest, when last we spoke together, it was but yesterday, in this very room, you must then have guessed the cause of the dreadful restraint that kept us asunder." "There was no need of guessing then," replied Agnes, smiling, "for you told me so distinctly." "Then why not on the instant remove the load from my heart? Were you quite incapable of feeling how galling it must have been to me?" "I'll tell you how that came to pass," said Agnes, rising. "Do you sit still there as I did yesterday, and say, 'Let me then confess to you, Colonel Hubert,' and then I will answer thus," and raising her hand as if to stop his speech, she added, mimicking his impatient tone, "Confess nothing, Miss Willoughby, to me,' and then you told me you had written to him, and when I exclaimed with some degree of dismay at the idea of your having written to recall him, you again interrupted me by saying that you would do it again, and then my aunt came, and so we parted. Then whose fault was it that I did not tell you?" "My own, Agnes, it was my own, and alas, I did not suffer for it alone. How wretched you must have been made by my vehemence! But you have forgiven me, and all this must be forgotten for ever. There is, however, one subject on which I would willingly ask a few more questions. These, I hope, you will answer, Agnes." "Yes," she replied gaily, "you may hope for an answer to all your questions, provided that just when I am about to speak you do not raise your arm thus, in order to prevent me." "I will do my utmost to avoid it," he replied, "and for the greater security will place the offending arm thus," throwing it round her. "And now tell me, Agnes, why it was that you would not accept Frederick Stephenson?" "And will you be pleased to tell me, Colonel Hubert, why it was that you did not propose to anybody else but me?" "Because I loved you, and you only." "Because I loved you, and you only," repeated Agnes. "Is that an echo?" said Colonel Hubert. "No," replied Agnes, "it is only the answer to your question." "Then exactly when I was occupied in finding reasons incontrovertible why the niece of Mrs. Barnaby should never be loved by mortal man, the lovely Agnes Willoughby was loving me?" "Even so," said Agnes, somewhat mournfully. "False impressions have worked us so much woe, that it would not be wise to let a little feminine punctilio prevent you seeing things as they are. Yet it is hardly fair, Hubert, to make me tell you this." "Oh, say not so," he replied. "Mistake not the source of this questioning, for, Agnes, be secure, that Hubert, for the wealth of all the world, would not offend thee." "But can you wonder that, after all I have suffered, my heart and soul thirsts for an assurance of your love? What might well suffice another, Agnes, ought not to suffice me. I am so much older." "I cannot help it, Montague. Nor could I help it when you took me out of the clutches of Major Allen upon the Windmill Hill, nor when you were pleased to be so gracious as to approve my singing, nor upon a great many other occasions, when it would have been wise for me to remember it, perhaps. But if I love you and you love me, I cannot see how your age or mine either need interfere to prevent it." Perhaps at last Colonel Hubert arrived at the same satisfactory conclusion, for the conversation was a long one; and before it was ended, some little sketchings of his feelings during the early part of their acquaintance brought to Agnes's mind the soothing belief that after the evening of the Clifton ball her image had not forsaken his fancy more, though it was by slow degrees that it had grown into what he called such terrible strength there as to conquer every other feeling. Agnes listened to him as he stated this with most humble-minded and unfeigned astonishment, but also with most willing belief, and then following his example, he quoted Shakespeare, exclaiming, "And if an angel should have come to me and told me thus, I would have believed no tongue but Hubert's." End of chapter 17. Volume 3, Chapter 18 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. A Retrospect and Conclusion. Mr. Willoughby was less punctual to his appointment than Colonel Hubert, and as the young Nora, weary with her journey, and exhausted from the excitement of the scenes which followed it, had not yet left her bed, he too had the advantage of a tete-a-tete. It is needless to enter upon any minute repetition of a narrative which had, in fact, little or no connection with the personages of our drama. It was evident that Mr. Willoughby had suffered much, both from the early loss of his fair young wife, and the continued hostility, or more properly speaking, the continued neglect of his family. He had exchanged into a regiment sent on a dangerous and disagreeable service, and with broken spirits and failing health, might very likely have perished before it was ended, had not his good gifts very suddenly made captive the affections of a young girl almost as pretty as poor Sophia Compton, and quite as rich as she was the contrary. This marriage converted him into the only son and heir of a wealthy merchant. All his new family required of him, in exchange for their daughter and their wealth, was that he should live amongst them. This he consented to do, but his life was not a happy one. With the prospect of great possessions before him, he was kept in almost penniless dependence upon his father-in-law; all his wants indeed profusely supplied, but with no more power to assist in the maintenance of the child he had left in England, than if he had been a slave chained to the oar. For 16 years he had led this painful life of penniless splendour, in the course of which he was again left a widower with one little girl; but though his existence in his father-in-law's family had lost its only charm by this event, he was prevented from making any effort to change it, as much by his total inability to support himself elsewhere, as by a consideration for the interest of his child. As she grew up, he began once more to feel that life was not altogether a bore and a burden, and at length his passive submission to years of wearying annoyance was rewarded by finding himself, at the death of the generous but tyrannical Mr. Grafton, the possessor of a handsome life income, and the sole guardian of the young heiress his daughter. It was then that, for the first time, he felt disposed to recall himself to the memory of those he had left behind in England; and the desire to do so became so strong, that he lost no time in finally arranging his affairs in the country of his exile, and taking his departure for Europe. For the sake of having a friend as commander of the ship in which he sailed, he took his passage for Havre, and, once landed on the coast of France, he yielded to Nora's entreaties that they should pass a few weeks at Paris before they left it. His accidental meeting with Mr. Stephenson there was then related, and its consequences as it respected his daughter and their journey home together concluded his narration. "Your romance, Mr. Willoughby," replied Miss Compton, "appears likely to come to a very happy conclusion; but I confess I wonder that never during your 16 years of what appears to have been very perfect leisure, you could never have found time to make any single inquiry about your little Agnes." "And I wonder at it too, Miss Compton. But it is more easy to recall the feelings that led to this than to explain them. I believe that the total impossibility of my transmitting any share of the wealth amidst which I lived to a child whom I had great reason to fear might want it, was the primary cause of it; and then came the hope that at no very distant day my inquiries for her might be made in a manner less torturing to my feelings than by acknowledging myself to be alive, in circumstances of high-fed pauperism, without the power of relieving any wants, however pressing, with which my inquiries might happen to make me acquainted. Had I known that you, Miss Compton, had adopted my little girl, I should not so long have suffered her to believe me dead, because I had not the power of making my being alive a source of joy to her." Whether Miss Compton thought this apology a good one, or the reverse, does not appear; for all the branches of the party who so unexpectedly met together at the house of Lady Elizabeth Norris continued from that time forward to live on terms of the most agreeable amity together; and perhaps the only symptom by which some little feeling of disapprobation might have been perceived, was Miss Compton's begging to decline, on the part of all interested, Mr. Willoughby's proposal of insuring his life for £10,000 as a portion for his eldest daughter. "I do assure you, sir, there is no occasion for it," said the little spinster, with great good humour, but also with a very evident intention of having her own way. "I believe that if you will mention this subject to Colonel Hubert, or to Lady Elizabeth Norris, his aunt, you will find that they both agree with me in thinking such a sacrifice of income on your part quite unnecessary, and decidedly unwise. Your sisters have not behaved to you kindly, but they have connected themselves well, and I believe we all think it would be more advantageous to both your daughters that their favours should be propitiated by your appearing before them in a style which may show you have no need of their assistance, than by anything else you can do for them. The young ladies are both about to marry well, and with fortunes very fairly proportioned to those of their respective husbands, and any family coolness with such near relations as Lady Eastcombe and the Honourable Mrs. Nivet would be both disadvantageous and disagreeable." "My noble sisters will be vastly well disposed to welcome me now, Miss Compton, I have little doubt," replied Mr. Willoughby, with as much asperity as he was capable of feeling for any offence committed against him. and I confess to you that the reconciliation would be particularly agreeable to me, from the power your generous adoption of my poor girl gives me now of proving to them that my marriage with Sophia Compton was not such a connection as to merit the severity with which they have treated it." "I have no sort of objection to your proving this to them in any manner that you please," replied Miss Compton, "and I rather think the most effectual mode of doing so will be, by permitting the portion of Agnes to be furnished by Sophia Compton's aunt." "5,000 then let it be, Miss Compton. 5,000 settled upon younger children," said Mr. Willoughby. "No, sir," persisted the old lady, "it must not be, if you please. The property of Compton Basett, with the name, and a sum of money withal sufficient considerably to add and to improve the estate, will be settled by me on the second son of your daughter Agnes. Lady Elizabeth, on the part of her nephew, adds £10,000 to the settlement on younger children, which, together with my property, will of course belong to Agnes for her life. I hope, sir, this statement will satisfy you respecting the provision to be made for Miss Willoughby, and prevent your feeling any further anxiety on the subject." It was impossible Mr. Willoughby could declare himself dissatisfied, and from this time he ventured no further allusion to the scheme of insuring his life. Preparations for the two marriages now immediately began, and the interval necessary to the completion of settlements and the building of carriages and dresses was, at the earnest request of Agnes, to be spent at Clifton. She loved the place, for it was identified in her memory with the first sight of Hubert, and she often declared that there was no spot on the earth's surface she should ever love so well as that little esplanade behind the windmill on which Colonel Hubert first offered her his arm, without deeming it necessary to utter a word of explanation for doing so. The vicinity of Mary Peters, too, was another reason, and no trifling one, for this partiality; and as not one of the party had any point of reunion to plead for in preference, it was there that several weeks of present enjoyment and happy anticipation were passed. It was about midway between the time at which everything was settled between the lovers, their beloveds, and all parents, friends, and guardians interested therein, and the happy day on which the double espousals were celebrated, that Mr. and Mrs. Peters invited the whole party to dinner. No strangers were permitted to disturb the freedom of the society thus assembled at dinner, though, to gratify Lady Elizabeth's love of music, one or two proficients in that science were invited for the evening. The gentlemen, who probably thought the society in the drawing room more agreeable than that of good Mr. Peters, even though backed by his excellent wine, were already partaking coffee with the ladies, when a reduplicated knocking announced the arrival of visitors. "The Chamberlains, I suppose," said Mrs. Peters. "How very early they are." But she was mistaken. It was not the Chamberlains, for a footman threw wide the drawing-room door and announced, "Mr. and Mrs. O'Donagough." "Mr. and Mrs. who?" said Mrs. Peters to Mary. "Mr. and Mrs. what?" said Elizabeth to Lucy. But before the parties thus questioned could have found time to answer, even had they possessed of the information required, a lady in sober-coloured silk, with little rouge and no ringlets, followed by a handsome young man in black, entered the room, and considerably before many who had seen that lady before could recall the name by which they had known her, or reconcile her much changed appearance to their puzzled recollections, Mrs. Peters was enfolded in her arms. "My dear sister Peters," said Mrs. O'Donagough, "you are surrounded by so large a party that I fear these last moments which I meant to dedicate to the affection of my kinsfolk may be more inconvenient than pleasurable to you. But you cannot, I am sure, refuse me some portion of your society this evening, as it is probably the last one we shall ever pass together. Give me leave, sister Peters, to introduce you to my husband, the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough. Mr. Peters, Mr. O'Donagough. Mr. James Peters, Mr. O'Donagough. Mr. O'Donagough, my dear Mary. My husband, young ladies, Mr. O'Donagough, my dear Elizabeth and Lucy. Good heaven! Agnes here? And my aunt Compton too? Well, so much the better, my dear Patrick. I shall now have the pleasure of presenting you to more relations, and as I should be proud to introduce you to all the world, this can only be an increase of pleasure to me. Agnes Willoughby, my dear, I can't say you behaved very well to me when the cheerful sort of life I indulged in, solely on your account, was changed for sorrow and imprisonment. But nevertheless, my religious principles, which are stronger, my dear, than even when you knew me, lead me to forgive you, and better still, they lead me to introduce you to your excellent and exemplary uncle, the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough." During the whole course of these speeches, not a single voice had been heard to pronounce a syllable in reply, excepting that of Mr. Peters, who put his heels together, and made a bow when she paused, husband in hand, before him, and said, "Your servant, sir." But Agnes, when her turn came, though colouring most painfully at being so addressed, and with her heart sinking under the unexampled annoyance of this intrusion, contrived to say, "I hope I see you well, aunt?" "Yes, Miss Agnes, well and happy too, I promise you. And I wish you were likely to be as well settled, child, as I am, but I should like to know who it has come forward with money to dress you up so. You have not been singing on the stage, I hope. Your uncle would be dreadfully shocked at such a thing, for he says that stage plays are an abomination. And upon my word, Aunt Compton, you are grown mighty smart too in your old age. Mercy on me, vanity of vanities, all is vanity." And then looking into the inner room, and perceiving that she had several more acquaintances there, she again took her husband by the hand and led him into it, presenting him to Lady Elizabeth, her niece Colonel Hubert, and the two Stephensons. But when she came to Mr. Willoughby, who was standing with his youngest daughter at a window, she stopped, and, looking at him very earnestly, seemed puzzled. He bowed, though evidently without knowing her, and then, turning from her unpleasantly curious scrutiny, resumed his conversation with Nora. "I beg your pardon, sir," said Mrs. O'Donagough, "but I should really be very much obliged if you would tell me your name." "My name, madam, is Willoughby." "Gracious heaven!" exclaimed the bride. "O'Donagough, dearest, this is an eventful day indeed. Behold your brother." The two gentlemen stared at each other with an expression of countenance more indicative of surprise than of fraternal affection. Mr. Willoughby, indeed, looked very much as if he suspected that the poor lady, be she who she would, was decidedly not in her right mind, while her husband, rather weary perhaps of such a continuity of introductions, escaped from her side and stationed himself at another window. "Willoughby, dearest Willoughby, is it possible that you can have forgotten me? Can you indeed have forgotten the sister of your wife?" "Miss Martha? Is it possible? I beg your pardon, Mrs. Donagough. I certainly did not recollect you. I hope that I have the pleasure of seeing you well." "My dearest Willoughby, you have no idea how exceedingly delighted I am to see you. What has become of you all this time? I always supposed that you had been sold for a slave on the coast of Barbary, and I thank God and my excellent husband. Where is he? I am sure the Reverend Mr. O'Donagough will thank God for your escape. And who is that pretty young lady? Dear me, she looks very much as if she was the daughter of your cruel master, and had fallen in love with you and set you at liberty. Poor Sophy! One could not expect you should remember her for ever. Even I, you see, have forced myself to forget my poor dear Mr. Barnaby. But now I think of it, you can't know anything about Mr. Barnaby. Do, my dear Willoughby, sit down with me on this sofa, and let us have a talk." It was impossible for Mr. Willoughby to refuse, even had he wished it, which he really did not, and the perfect security of being welcome, which Mrs. O'Donagough displayed in her manner of establishing herself, in some sort obliged Mrs. Peters to act as if she were so. The different groups which had been arranged by her entrance resumed their conversation. Coffee and tea included the intruders in its round, and everybody excepting Miss Compton seemed once more tolerably at their ease. She could not affect to recover her equanimity like the rest, but placing a low chair immediately behind the sofa on which Lady Elizabeth's tall figure was placed, she sat down so as to be completely concealed by her, saying, "Will your ladyship have the great kindness to let me hide myself here? That horrible woman is, I confess it, my own brother's daughter, but she is, no matter what she is, I am much to blame, no doubt, but I hate to look upon her." "Put yourself quite at your ease, Miss Compton," replied Lady Elizabeth, laughing. "I have not the least difficulty in the world in comprehending your feelings. In you she has conquered the feeling of relationship. In me, an instinct stronger still perhaps, namely, that of finding amusement in absurdity. but I almost think she has cured me of my menagerie caprice for ever. Yet it is difficult, too, not to enjoy the spectacle she offers with her young husband in her hand. But I don't mean to lose my music for her. Miss Peters, my dear, pray set your pianoforte going." This hint was immediately obeyed, and proved extremely conducive to the general ease. Good-natured Mr. Peters entered into conversation with the reverend missionary, and soon learnt both his destination, and the interesting fact that he and his bride were to sail from the port of Bristol the day but one following. This he judiciously took an opportunity of speedily communicating to his lady, who took care that it should not long remain a secret to any individual present, excepting Mr. Willoughby, who continued in too close conversation with his sister-in-law to permit his being made a sharer in the general feeling of satisfaction which this information produced. Even Miss Compton, on hearing it, declared that if the bride were really going to set off immediately for Botany Bay, there to remain for the term of her natural life, she thought she should be able to look at her for the rest of the evening with great philosophy. And in proof of her sincerity, she moved her place, and seated herself beside her friend Lady Elizabeth, more than half inclined to share in the amusement, which, notwithstanding her good resolutions, that facetious lady seemed inclined to take in contemplating the newly married pair. The conversation, meanwhile, between the two old acquaintances went on with considerable interest on both sides. Mr. Willoughby again related his adventures, and introduced his pretty daughter, and then, recurring once more to Silverton, Mrs. O'Donagough said, in an accent that betokened considerable interest in the question, " Willoughby, can you tell me anything about your old friend Tate? I have heard nothing of him of late years, but of course you know that he married his cousin Miss Temple very soon after we left Silverton." "Very soon?" said Mrs. O'Donagough, with a sigh. "Yes, my dear sister," replied Willoughby, with a melancholy smile. "It is not often that hearts lost in country quarters fail to return to the losers as they march out of the town. Happily both for the boys and girls concerned, but few such adventures end as mine did." "Happily indeed for me," replied the bride, with a toss of her head. "For aught I know, Tate may be alive now, and the happy wife of O'Donagough may well rejoice that no such thraldom was the consequence of Captain Tate's presumptuous attachment." Though Mr. Peters was really very civil, and though Mr. James joined for several minutes in the conversation, it is probable that the reverend missionary did not enjoy it so much as his lady did listening to Mr. Willoughby; for at an early hour he told her it was time to take leave. She instantly obeyed, and began making her circular farewell, a ceremony of rather an embarrassing nature to many of the party, for out of the 15 persons she left in the room she kissed 8. Lady Elizabeth, Sir Edward and Lady Stephenson, Colonel Hubert, and Frederick, being permitted to escape without even an attempt at joining them in this valedictory greeting, and Miss Compton, rising at her approach, making her by far the lowest courtesy her niece ever performed, in a manner which effectually averted it from herself. Mrs. O'Donagough's departure from England was a great blessing to all the connections she left behind, for, had she continued within reach of them, it is hardly possible but some annoyance would have been the consequence. As it was, however, sorrow seemed to depart with her, for seldom does so large a portion of happiness as fell to the lot of those she had formerly tormented attend the career of any. Colonel Hubert, although he actually did very soon become a general, never again felt any alarm on the score of his age, but had the happiness of knowing that he was beloved with all the devoted tenderness that his heart desired, and his noble character deserved. Agnes never ceased to glory in her choice, and loved nothing better than to make Aunt Betsy confess that her great nephew, notwithstanding his being a general, was more like a hero than any other man she had ever seen. Miss Compton lived to see an extremely fine lad, called Compton Hubert Compton, becoming so fond of the fields and pheasants of Compton Basset, as to leave her no rest till she had persuaded the trustees of the settlement she had made to expend the money in their hands upon the purchase of some neighbouring lands, including the manner in which they were situated, and the converting of the old roomy farmhouse into a residence which she confessed to be worthy of the representative of the ancient Compton race. This alteration, indeed, took place several years before the old lady died, and it was at Compton Basset, thus metamorphosed, that she had the pleasure of observing to Mrs. Wilmot that the conversation they had held on that spot together had not been altogether without effect. Mr. Willoughby and his elegant sisters become perfectly reconciled, a circumstance extremely agreeable to Lady Elizabeth Norris, as it gave her repeated opportunities of convincing herself that the nose of her niece, Mrs. General Hubert, was decidedly an improvement upon that of the Honourable Miss Nivet, though the family resemblance was sufficiently remarkable. Frederick and Nora were as gay and happy a couple as ever enjoyed 10,000 a year together. Occasionally, of course, they were in debt, as all people of 10,000 a year must be ; but on the whole they contrived to bring matters round wonderfully well, and as their property was fortunately settled, and Sir Edward happened to die without children, their family of 6 sons and 6 daughters were left at last very tolerably provided for. Mrs. O'Donagough's voyage to England was quite as agreeable as such a voyage generally is, and on arriving she was greatly consoled for any little inequalities in her young husband's temper by the great success of his preaching. For at least 6 months after their arrival he was more in the fashion than any gentleman of any profession had ever been before; but at the end of that time the reverend preacher unfortunately was present at a horse race, upon which the recondite wisdom of the fable, which treats of a cat turned into a woman, must have become manifest to every reflecting mind acquainted with the circumstances of Mr. O'Donagough's early life, for no sooner did the race begin, than almost unconsciously he offered a bet to one of his congregation who stood near him, and before the end of the day he was seen mounted in a blue and yellow jacket riding for a jockey who had broken his leg in a hurdle race. It was then that Mrs. O'Donagough became sensible of the blessing of having a settlement, and thankful was she to the noble father of her spouse for all the care bestowed to prevent his bringing himself again to penury, when he was brought home dead to her one fine afternoon, having lost his seat and his life together in a leap upon which he had betted considerably more than he possessed. She mourned for him as he deserved, but not being upon this occasion very nice upon whom she could devolve the task of wearing black, she announced to all her Sydney friends that it was not the fashion in the old world for ladies of distinction to wear that dismal colour for more than a month for any husband who died by accident. And it was, therefore, once more, in all the splendour of her favourite rainbow colouring, that she met a few months afterwards her old friend, Major Allen. He entered into no very tedious or particular details respecting the reasons for, or the manner of, his voyage out, but testified much cordial satisfaction at the meeting; while, on the other hand, Mrs. O'Donagough was as remarkably communicative as he was the reverse, dilating largely on my Lord 's careful attention to her interest on her marriage with his son, who had insisted upon coming out in a fit of religious enthusiasm, which, as she sensibly observed, was not at all likely to last. It was not very long after this meeting that Mrs. O'Donagough became aware of the truth of the song which says, Mais on retourne toujours à ses premières amours. For it was evident that the sentiment which circumstances had so rudely shaken at Clifton a year or two before, was again putting forth its leaves and flowers, and that it depended upon herself alone whether she should not yet become the wife of the accomplished Major Allen. For a few weeks she struggled with her remaining affection, but at the end of that time it overpowered all her doubts and fears, and only stipulating that, as before, all she had should be firmly settled upon herself, she once more entered the holy state of matrimony. In justice to the peerage, it ought to be stated that on this her 3rd wedding day she wore round her neck a very handsome necklace of shell, carefully sent out to her by the confidential agent of my Lord Mucklebury. End of chapter 18 in volume 3. End of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. Recorded by Celine Major.